The wind of the New Mexico territory was a thief. It stole warmth from the skin and words from the mouth, replacing them with the grit of 1,000 sun-bleached miles. It howled across the plains, a lonely, ceaseless sound that bent the stubborn mesquite and sent tumbleweeds racing like skeletal animals into the oppressive dark. Tonight, the wind had an accomplice in the moonless sky, and together they conspired to swallow the world whole. For Elara Wynn, they were the backdrop to a more immediate and terrifying symphony, the frantic pounding of her own heart and the rhythmic, predatory thunder of hoofbeats behind her. She ran, her lungs burned with an acid fire, each breath a ragged tear in the fabric of the night, the worn leather of her boots, never meant for such a desperate flight. Scuffed and slipped on the loose scree, her world had shrunk to the narrow, treacherous path her eyes could barely discern. A ghostly ribbon of pale sand twisting through the clawing shapes of yucca and cholla cactus. Clutched to her chest, held in a death grip by both arms, was a simple canvas satchel. It was thin, lumpy with its contents, and felt heavier than a sack of stones. It was her sin, her hope, her death warrant. She could not let it go. A shout, guttural and indistinct, was ripped away by the wind, but the intent was clear. They were closing the distance. Glancing over her shoulder was a mistake, a foolish waste of a precious half-second, but the primal fear demanded it. 3 of them, 3 riders, dark shapes melding with their powerful mounts, becoming monstrous centaurs of the night. The leader held a torch aloft, and its wild, sputtering flame cast their shadows long and grotesque, dancing devils that stretched and snapped at her heels. The light was a predator in itself, seeking her, pinning her against the vast emptiness of the desert. Another tongue of flame licked the air, this one closer. A stray ember, spat from the torch, landed on the back of her worn cotton dress. It was no more than a spark, but it felt like the brand of a hot iron against her skin. She gasped, a sound lost to the gale, and slapped at her back, stumbling but not falling. The brief, sharp pain was a brutal reminder of how close they were, how little room for error she had left. The smell of singed fabric joined the sense of dust and her own terrified sweat. Her mind, sharpened by adrenaline, raced over the map of the local terrain she had memorized during quieter, safer times. Dry Willow. The settlement was a few miles ahead, but it was no sanctuary. It was the heart of the rot she was fleeing. But just before the town lay the creek, Silver Thread Creek, and the bridge, the old wooden bridge, a relic from a more optimistic time, was her only chance. The pounding of the hooves grew louder, a frantic, syncopated rhythm that seemed to vibrate up from the very ground into the soles of her feet. It was the sound of the world ending. She could hear the snorting of the horses, the jingle of their harnesses, the creak of saddle leather. They were close enough that a well-aimed rope could find her. She pushed harder, her legs screaming in protest, her vision tunneling until only the path ahead existed. Then she heard it, a different sound beneath the wind and the chase, the faint, rushing murmur of water, the creak, hope, sharp and painful, pierced through the fog of her panic. She burst from a thicket of sagebrush and saw it. The creek was a slash of silver black in the darkness, wider than she remembered, swollen with the last of the distant mountain melt. And the bridge was a skeleton. A recent flash flood, she guessed, had torn the heart out of it. Several planks were missing from the center, leaving a gaping, impassable maw. The remaining structure sagged drunkenly towards the water. There was no choice. To stop was to be caught. To be caught was a fate she refused to contemplate. Without breaking stride, she veered away from the ruined bridge and plunged directly into the creek. The cold was a physical blow. It was a vicious, paralyzing shock that drove the air from her lungs in a choked gasp. It was the cold of deep earth, of winter graves, a cold that felt ancient and malevolent. The water surged around her thighs, its current strong and insistent, trying to drag her downstream, to pull her under. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably, a violent, rattling percussion against the terror in her chest. She held the canvas bag high, her arms aching with the strain, protecting it from the greedy water. The hem of her dress, already heavy with dust, became a leaden shroud, tangling around her legs, threatening to trip her with every agonizing step. She fought her way across, her boots sinking into the slick, muddy bottom. Stones, smooth and treacherous, rolled under her feet. Twice, she nearly went down, her frantic scrabbling the only thing keeping her upright. The far bank seemed 100 miles away. Behind her, she heard the riders pull up short at the bridge. Curses cut through the wind. They wouldn't risk their horses in the fast-moving, uncertain water. Not at night. It was a small, temporary victory, but it was everything. She clawed her way up the muddy bank on the other side, a sodden, shivering wreck. She didn't look back. She just ran, water streaming from her clothes, her boots squelching with each heavy step. The cold was now inside her, a deep, gnawing ache in her bones. She needed shelter. She needed a fire. She needed a miracle. And then she saw it. At first, it was just a smudge of yellow. A pinprick of light so faint she thought it might be a trick of her exhausted eyes, perhaps a distant star stubbornly refusing to be extinguished by the night. But as she crested a low rise, it became clearer, a single square of light, warm and steady. A window. It belonged to a house, a lonely silhouette against the bruised purple of the horizon. A ranch, set far back from the creek and the main trail to town. An island of solitude in the vast, dark ocean of the plains. Ortega Ridge. The map in her head supplied the Hale place. The light was a beacon, a silent promise of warmth, of safety, of life. It was a destination. She stumbled towards it, her legs moving with a mechanical, desperate will of their own. The cold was making her clumsy, her thoughts slow and thick. A violent cough racked her body. A dry, hacking sound that scraped her raw throat. She pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling the noise, her gaze locked on that solitary light. Coulter Hale heard the sound over the familiar groaning of the windmill. It was a sound that didn't belong to the night. It wasn't the cry of a coyote or the lowing of a restless steer. It was human. A cough, ragged and desperate. He set down the leather strap he was mending and stood up, his tall frame unfolding from the chair with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who lives alone and measures his days by the sun and the seasons. For 4 years, since Martha's passing, the only sounds in this house had been the ones he made himself, or the ones the land offered up. This was different. He took the oil lamp from the table, its warm glow illuminating a face carved by sun and solitude. At 35, Coulter's features were set in a permanent cast of stoicism, his blue eyes holding a deep, quiet sorrow that time had failed to erase. He was a man rooted to this land, a widower who had let his world shrink to the borders of his ranch, finding a harsh but honest comfort in the punishing rhythm of work. He moved to the door and stepped out onto the covered porch. The wind met him with a dry, hot breath, a bad sign for the coming months. He held the lamp high, its light cutting a shaky circle into the profound darkness. His gaze swept the yard, past the water trough and the silent corral. At first, he saw nothing. Then, a flicker of movement near the gate. A woman. She was leaning against the sturdy gatepost as if it were the only thing holding her upright. She was drenched, her dark hair plastered to her face and neck, her dress a tattered ruin clinging to her slender frame. Her body was racked with shivers, but it was her face that held him. It was pale, streaked with dirt, and etched with exhaustion. But her eyes, fixed on the light from his lamp, were luminous. They were wide with fear. Yes, but beneath the fear was a fierce, unyielding glint of defiance. It was the look of a cornered animal that had not yet surrendered, a spark of life that refused to be snuffed out. Coulter had seen enough of death. He recognized the desperate fight for life when he saw it. He didn't call out. He didn't ask questions. Questions were a luxury, and this woman looked like she had none to spare. He simply walked the length of the porch, his boots making a soft, solid sound on the weathered planks. He unlatched the gate, its familiar creak loud in the sudden lull of the wind. As he drew near, he shrugged off the heavy canvas coat he wore over his shirt. It was old and smelled of leather, wood smoke, and the faint, clean scent of the plains, but it was thick and warm. He held it out to her. She flinched at his sudden proximity, her eyes darting from his face to the darkness behind her. But she didn't run. He draped the coat over her trembling shoulders. She was so cold that the heat of his own body, trapped in the fabric, seemed to radiate from it instantly. He saw her sag with relief, a small, involuntary sigh escaping her lips. Her hands, which had been clutching a muddy canvas bag to her chest, tightened their grip. That bag, he noted, was as important to her as her own breathing. "Come on," he said, his voice low and rough from disuse. It was all that was needed. He put a steadying hand on her elbow, feeling the violent tremors that shook her. He felt the sharp angles of her bones beneath the wet cloth. He guided her through the gate and up the steps, his own large frame shielding her from the worst of the wind. He led her not into the sparse front room, but straight through to the kitchen at the back of the house. It was the heart of the ranch, the only room that held a constant, living warmth. The air inside was thick with the comforting smells of coffee and burning piñon wood. A fire glowed in the cast-iron stove, its heat a welcome, tangible presence. Alara felt the warmth on her face, and her legs finally gave out. She would have crumpled to the floor if not for the strong, steadying grip on her arm. He guided her to a simple wooden chair by the stove, and she sank into it, the coat a heavy, protective weight around her. She was trembling, a deep, uncontrollable quaking that was born of both the freezing water and the terror that had been her companion for days. Her hands, numb and white-knuckled, were still fused to the canvas bag on her lap. She couldn't stop shaking. She couldn't stop seeing the torchlight in her mind. From the edge of Coulter's property, the riders had watched the small drama unfold. They saw the door open, saw the rancher step out, saw him give the woman his coat and lead her inside. Their leader, a man with a cruel twist to his mouth, spat into the dust. This changed things. Coulter Hale was not a man to be trifled with. He kept to himself. But the old-timers knew the story of the claim jumpers who had tried to crowd his land years ago. Haley didn't talk about it, and neither did anyone else, because the claim jumpers weren't around to tell their side. Harassing a lone woman in the desert was one thing. Kicking in the door of a man like Hale, on his own land, was another proposition entirely. After a moment of frustrated hesitation, the leader yanked on his reins, turning his horse with a sharp, angry motion. The others followed, their forms melting back into the darkness from which they came. The thunder of their pursuit faded, replaced once more by the lonesome voice of the wind. Inside the kitchen, Coulter heard the hoofbeats recede. He walked to the front door and slid the heavy wooden bolt into place. The sound was solid, final, a barrier between the woman and the night. He returned to the kitchen, his movements unhurried. He took the heavy iron kettle from the stove and filled it with water from the pump by the sink, the rhythmic squeak of the handle a simple, domestic sound in the tense silence. He placed the kettle back on the hot surface, where it soon began to hiss softly. He didn't look at her directly, not wanting to spook her further, but his gaze fell upon her hands, still clenched around the bag. Her knuckles were scraped raw, and on her wrist, peeking from the cuff of her tattered sleeve, were angry red abrasions, the kind a rope might make. A familiar, cold knot tightened in his gut. It was the feeling of seeing suffering and being helpless to undo it, a feeling he knew all too well. He had seen marks like that once before, on Martha. The memory was a ghost that never left this house. Outside, the windmill spun, its metal blades catching the hot, dry wind. It let out a long, high-pitched shriek, a mournful, metallic cry against the unending darkness. It was the sound of a parched land, a warning of a coming season where the heat would be relentless, the sky would be a merciless, empty blue, and the drought, already settling deep into the bones of the earth, would only grow worse. The hiss of the kettle was the only sound in the kitchen, a counter-rhythm to the wind's low moan and the frantic, silent pounding of Alara's heart. Coulter Hale moved with a quiet efficiency that was almost unnerving. He was a man who wasted no motions. He retrieved a clean basin from a low shelf and a small, scarred wooden box that contained his meager medical supplies. He pumped water into the basin, then added a splash of hot water from the kettle, testing the temperature with his fingers. He brought the basin, a bar of harsh lye soap, and a few strips of clean linen to the table. He didn't sit, but knelt on one knee beside her chair, bringing himself down to her level. It was a gesture of servitude, or perhaps simply of practicality, but its effect was profound. He was not towering over her. Alara flinched, pulling the heavy coat tighter. Her gaze was fixed on his hands as he dipped a small, clean rag into the water. "Your hands," he said, his voice low. "And that wrist, they need cleaning. The lie will sting, but it's better than the alternative." She stared at him, her mind a whirlwind of distrust. Every kindness she had known in the last 6 months had been a barbed hook, a prelude to a demand, but the exhaustion was a powerful weight, and the throbbing in her hands was a persistent, fiery complaint. Slowly, as if surrendering a weapon, she loosened her grip on the canvas satchel with one hand, keeping it pinned to her lap with the other. She extended her right hand, palm down, over the basin. His touch was the first thing to truly break through her terror. His hands were what she expected, broad, hard, and mapped with the calluses of a man who fought the earth for a living. But the way he held her hand was not. He was incredibly gentle, his thumb supporting her palm while his fingers worked the wet rag over her raw knuckles, meticulously cleaning the desert grit from the broken skin. He was careful, his touch impersonal yet deeply considerate, a focused, medicinal contact that asked for nothing and offered only succor. He moved to the angry red abrasions on her wrist, cleaning them with the same detached care. He didn't ask how she got them. He didn't comment on their origin. He simply tended to the wound. After days of running, of being hunted, of existing as a creature of pure, animalistic fear, this simple, humane act of tending was her undoing. A sound tore itself from her chest, a ragged, shuddering sigh that was half a sob. It was the first full breath she had taken since she'd climbed out of the creek. It was the sound of a spring, coiled too tight for too long, finally slipping one agonizing notch. Her voice, when she spoke, was a dry rasp, alien to her own ears. "Alara," she whispered. "My name is Alara Wynne." It was the only truth she had to offer, a small, polished stone of identity offered in exchange for this sanctuary. He nodded once, his eyes still on his work. "Coulter Hale." He finished his task, drying her skin with a different cloth before loosely wrapping a strip of clean linen around her wrist. The knot he tied was practical, secure. He didn't linger. He stood, rinsed his hands in the basin, and moved back to the stove. The entire exchange had been conducted with a profound, unspoken respect for the boundaries of her fear. He took 2 tin mugs from a hook, the metal scraping softly, into each. He spooned a small measure of dried, grayish-green leaves from a canister. "Sage tea," he said, more to the room than to her. He poured the steaming water, and a sharp, earthy aroma instantly filled the air, cutting through the smells of dust and wet wool. He set one mug on the table near her, well within her reach, but not pushing it at her. He took the other and leaned his tall frame against the far counter, near the sink, cradling the warm mug in his own scarred hands. He had given her warmth, medical care, and now, distance. Alara stared at the mug. It was an anchor in a swirling, unreal world. She wrapped her clean, bandaged hand around it, the heat a blissful, stinging shock to her cold fingers. She lifted it and sighed. The tea was strong, bitter, and cleansing. It tasted of the high desert itself, of resilience, of survival. Coulter gestured with his chin toward a neatly folded square of cloth on the corner of the table. "I'll be out on the porch for a spell. Checking on the stock. There's a clean shirt." It was homespun, the color of oatmeal. Coarse but clean. "You should get out of those wet things. It's warmer. You can change by the stove. No one will bother you." He hadn't offered her a room, an act that might imply a longer stay, a more complicated debt. He had offered a simple, immediate comfort, a dry shirt. He took his coat from where it hung by the door, the one she had shucked off and left on the chair, and shrugged it back on. Then, without another word, he stepped out the back door, closing it softly behind him. He didn't bolt it, she noted. He was trusting her in his house, or perhaps he simply wasn't afraid of her. She wasn't sure which was more startling. For a long moment, she didn't move. She just listened to the rising shriek of the wind outside. The kitchen, by contrast, felt impossibly still, a pocket of warm, lamplit silence. She slid off the chair and picked up the shirt. It was heavy, honest cloth, shivering. She turned her back to the doors and, with her eyes fixed on the windows, she unbuttoned her sodden dress. The wet fabric peeled away from her skin, and the air of the room, which had felt so warm, was suddenly cold on her damp chemise. She dropped the muddy dress in a heap and quickly, awkwardly, pulled the large homespun shirt over her head. It fell to her knees, a shapeless, roomy tent. The sleeves were far too long, and she had to roll them back twice. But it was dry. It was blessedly, miraculously dry. It smelled of lye soap, faint wood smoke, and something else, the clean, neutral scent of the man who owned it. She felt swallowed by it. But for the first time, she also felt hidden. She was no longer the bedraggled fugitive. She was a shapeless shadow, warmed by a stranger's charity. She sat back down, tucking her cold feet up under the hem of the shirt, and nursed the hot tea. The silence of the house settled around her, thick and profound. It was broken only by the crackle of the juniper in the stove and a new, insistent sound, a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof. Rain. Her heart leaped. Rain would wash away her tracks, obliterate her trail. It was a reprieve, a miracle. She looked up, hope flickering. When Coulter returned, he moved so quietly she didn't hear him until the door latch clicked. He stamped the dust from his boots on the mat, his face grim from the wind. He saw her looking at the ceiling, listening. He shook his head, dashing the hope before she could even voice it. "Phantom rain," he said, his voice flat. He hung his coat back on the peg. "It's not water, it's the wind, throwing sand and dry grass against the tin. It's a trick the land plays. All the sound of a storm, none of the water." The illusion of peace shattered. The sound was not a comfort. It was a mockery. It was the sound of the drought, of the persistent, abrasive wind that was scouring the land dry. Alara looked away from the ceiling, a bitter taste in her mouth that had nothing to do with the sage. Her eyes, now fully adjusted to the lamplight, began to trace the lines of the room, not as a guest, but as a fugitive. They were the eyes of a clerk, trained to see patterns, to assess value and risk. They passed over the simple, sturdy furniture, the clean-swept floor, the neatly stacked pans, and then they found the map. It was tacked to the wall between the pantry and the back door, a large, hand-drawn chart of the surrounding territory. It was rendered in charcoal and grease pencil, with topographical lines, creek beds, and routes clearly marked. Her gaze locked onto it. She stood, leaving her tea, and moved closer, drawn by a force stronger than her fear. Her bandaged finger traced the thin blue line of the Silver Thread Creek, the red dot labeled Dry Willow, and finally, the small, inked square she was standing in Ortega Ridge. Her mind, the part of her that was all ledgers and logic, clicked into place. She saw it instantly. The ranch was not just a random homestead, it was a nexus. It sat at the perfect junction of three major routes: the main drover's trail from the north, the supply route to Santa Mesa from the east, and the access path to the lower plains that fed into Dry Willow. "You're at a crossroads," she murmured, the words escaping her before she could stop them. Coulter had been watching her, his expression unreadable. He walked over to the stove, not to loom over her, but to add another piece of wood. "The cattle pass through," he confirmed, his voice neutral. "Or they used to, when there was grass and the creek ran full." "It's more than that," she said, her voice sharpening with the clarity of her discovery. "It's a strategic point. Anyone who controls this ridge, they don't just control the trails. They control the approach. They control the water." She tapped the map, her fingernail making a small clicking sound. "The creek, it runs right along your property line." As he watched her, Coulter felt a shift in his understanding of the woman he had pulled from the dark. This was not the broken, shivering creature from the gate. Her eyes were no longer wide with just terror. They were sharp, assessing, analytical. She was reading his land, calculating its strengths and weaknesses. He realized, with a jolt of stark admiration, that she was still, even now, measuring her position. She was looking for avenues of escape, for defensible positions, for leverage. This woman was courageous. She was a fighter who had been momentarily overwhelmed, but she was not defeated. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed into the side of the house, a physical blow that seemed to shake the very foundation. The old window frame rattled in its casing with a sound like dry bones clacking together. On the table, the oil lamp's flame guttered, dipping low and sending wild, elongated shadows dancing across the walls. The sound was too sudden, too close to the sound of a fist on a door, a hand trying the latch. Ilara's breath hitched. She spun away from the map, her hand flying to her throat. The satchel, which she had left on the chair, was instantly snatched up, clutched to her chest like a shield. The fragile, domestic peace of the room evaporated, replaced by the raw, immediate memory of the chase. Her body tensed, her eyes darting between the rattling window and the bolted door. Coulter did not move. He didn't startle. He didn't reach for her. He didn't offer a single empty word of comfort. He simply stood by the stove, a solid, immovable object in the chaotic room. He met her panicked gaze with his own. His eyes were steady, calm, and utterly unafraid. It was the look of a man who had heard that same wind howl for 1,000 nights. A man who knew the language of his house, of its groans and its protests against the storm. His gaze held hers, an anchor of quiet strength, and it said, more clearly than any words, "This is my home. The wind stays out. I am not alarmed. You do not need to be." He held that look, unflinching, until her rigid posture softened, until her frantic breathing slowed from a gasp to a shaky sigh. The terror receded, leaving a residue of adrenaline. The quiet, the implicit safety, the sheer decency of his stillness was more disorienting than the pursuit. The fear, having been so violently summoned and then so quietly dismissed, left a vacuum that her tightly held secret rushed to fill. The words tumbled out of her, a desperate, disjointed confession. "They weren't chasing me for money," she blurted, her voice low and fierce. "I didn't steal anything, not like that." Coulter waited. He was a patient man, as patient as the mountains, and he knew how to listen. She clutched the canvas bag, her knuckles white. "It's just paper. Proof!" Her voice dropped to a desperate whisper, a secret that was burning a hole in her. "I'm carrying something. If it falls into the wrong hands, the whole town will go thirsty." The words hung in the warm, lamp-lit air, heavy and cold as a block of ice. "The whole town will go thirsty." in this dry, unforgiving land. It was a sentence of death. It meant the end of the herds, the withering of the small garden plots, the ruin of settlements like Dry Willow. It was a threat more potent and more terrifying than a dozen gunmen. Here was the true test. Coulter's face remained impassive, but his eyes, which had been calm, now sharpened. He understood the weight of that threat. He lived by the whims of the Silver Thread Creek just as much as any man in Dry Willow. He could have demanded to see the proof. He could have demanded to know who she was, who was after her, and why she had brought this trouble to his door. He could have seen her as a liability, or worse, as a pawn in a game he didn't yet understand. He did none of those things. He didn't press her. He didn't call her a liar or a fool. He simply accepted her statement, and in doing so, he accepted the burden of it. He gave her the one thing she needed more than warmth or linen bandages. He gave her his belief. Wordlessly, he turned from her and went to the wood bin. He selected a thick, heavy log of juniper, its bark shedding a dry, spicy scent. He unlatched the firebox of the stove, and a wave of radiant heat washed over him. With a grunt, he settled the log onto the glowing red coals. A shower of bright orange sparks danced up the flue. He used the iron poker to nudge the log into its final place, where it began to crackle, caught by the intense heat. The action was simple, practical. He was feeding the fire, ensuring the kitchen would stay warm through the rest of the long, cold night. But to Elara, watching him, the act was a covenant. He was adding fuel. He was reinforcing the sanctuary. He was, in his own silent, resolute way, choosing a side. He was warming the room, and in doing so, he was steadying the trembling, frozen core of her soul. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For tonight, she was safe. And then, from the porch, a new sound cut through the wind. It was not the house, and it was not the storm. It was a low, single woof. Elara's head snapped toward the back door, her newfound calm vanishing. Coulter raised a hand, silencing her before she could speak. "Gus," he said, his voice a low rumble. "My dog. He sleeps on the porch." He tilted his head, listening. The wind howled, but there was no follow-up bark, no growl, no frantic alarm, just that one, short, inquisitive sound. Coulter moved to the window beside the door, pushing the shutter open just a fraction of an inch. He peered into the black, wind-scoured yard. He saw nothing, only the dark, familiar shapes of the corral and the trough, and the endless empty plains beyond. "What is it?" Elara whispered, already on her feet. He closed the shutter, his face set in grim lines. "He's an old dog," Coulter said, turning back to her. The warmth of the room seemed to recede. "But his ears are sharp. That bark, that's his 'someone was here' bark. Not 'someone is here,' was here." The implication landed on them both with a physical weight. The riders. They had followed her tracks all the way to the ranch. They had seen the lamplight. They had seen him take her in. They had lingered, watching the house, assessing the man who had given her shelter. And then, for reasons of their own, they had decided to retreat. They were gone, but they knew exactly where she was. The isolation of Ortega Ridge, which had been her salvation, was now her prison. This house was no longer a random sanctuary. It was a target. The knowledge that they were found, that this isolated ranch was now a marked location, settled into the small, warm kitchen like a shroud. The phantom rain, that dry, abrasive whisper of sand against the tin roof was no longer a mockery, but a countdown. Elara's breath was tight in her chest. The small measure of safety she had felt was gone, evaporated by that single, sharp bark from the dog. She had not just found sanctuary. She had brought a curse to this man's door. "He knows you," Coulter stated. His voice was flat, devoid of accusation, but the words hung in the air. "The man who leads them, you know his name." Elara nodded. her hands twisting the coarse fabric of the borrowed shirt. She had to tell him. He had earned the truth with his kindness, and now he had earned it with his peril. "Silas Kincaid," she said, the name tasting like ash. "The man who owns Dry Willow." Coulter's expression didn't change, but a flicker of grim understanding passed through his eyes. No one in the territory didn't know the name. Kincaid had arrived 5 years prior, a man of sharp suits and sharper smiles, claiming his family had old, forgotten Spanish grants to tracts of land nobody had ever bothered to dispute. He built the distillery first, a massive, thirsty operation that ran day and night, turning wagon loads of grain into barrels of raw, potent whiskey. Then, he'd open the saloon, the hotel, and the mercantile. He was the town's economy. "He's not a rancher," Coulter said, his gaze distant, processing. "He's a businessman." "He's a thief," Alara corrected, her voice low and trembling with a cold fury. "He's stealing the land, not with a gun, but with paper. He calls them water contracts. He finds ranchers who are struggling, men whose wells are running low. He offers them a generous loan to see them through the drought, secured only by their signature on a complex document they can't read." She walked back to the table, her mind seeing the neat columns of her old ledgers. "I read it. I was his clerk. I managed the books for his drilling company. The contract says that if they miss a single payment, they don't forfeit the land. They forfeit the water rights. And in this territory, land without water is just dust. He gets the rights, the ranch fails, and he buys the worthless land for pennies on the dollar. He's building an empire by choking everyone else out." Coulter remained silent, but his jaw was a hard line. He was seeing the shape of the trap. "But Kincaid can't be seen doing the dirty work," Alara continued, her voice gaining a desperate, brittle edge. "That's why he has Deputy Rusk." "Rusk." Coulter spoke the name as if it were a separate, fouler taste. The deputy was a blowhard, a man who wore his tin star like a shield, his hand always resting on the butt of his revolver. "Kincaid's enforcer," Alara confirmed. "Anyone who questions the contracts, anyone who tries to organize, they suddenly find themselves in violation of some obscure ordinance. Vagrancy. Disturbing the peace. Failure to pay a tax. Rusk can't read a law book, but he's an expert at inventing laws that only apply to Kincaid's enemies. The men chasing me last night, they weren't just hired thugs. They were Rusk's men. They were the law." Coulter finally moved, pouring more water from the kettle into his mug. The sage leaves had steeped for too long, and the tea would be punishingly bitter. But he didn't seem to notice. "He's squeezing the valley. We all knew it, but no one knew how. A water contract is still a contract. A man's signature is his bond." "Not if the contract is based on a lie." Alara said. She touched the canvas satchel, which she had set on the table like a holy relic. "I was good at my job. Too good. I balanced his books, the ones he showed the bank, the ones he showed the territory inspectors. But one night, I was working late. Rusk came in, drunk, looking for Kincaid. He knocked over a stack of grain receipts, and behind them, there was a second ledger, the real one." Her eyes were bright with the memory of her transgression, the moment her life had split in two. It wasn't just about money. It listed payments for redirecting culverts, for experimental drilling, for geological surveys. And then I found the map. She paused, her breath catching. "That's what's in this bag. Kincaid's entire operation is a fraud. He's been telling everyone the Silver Thread Creek is failing, that the drought is drying it up. He told them his private drilling company found a new, deep aquifer, one that he controls. That's the water he's selling rights to." "I've seen the new wells," Coulter said, his voice a low rumble. "Up north, past the reservoir." "It's a lie." Alara's hand slammed on the table, startling them both. "His wells are a show. The map, Coulter, it's a geological survey, an aquifer map drawn by a real engineer from back east. It proves the Silver Thread Creek isn't drying up naturally, and it proves its source, The headwaters, they're not on Kincaid's land. They never were. They're on public land, land belonging to the territory, to everyone. The secret was out, a living, breathing thing in the small kitchen. He's been illegally damming and diverting the creek's tributaries into his own private reservoir, creating a man-made drought to panic the ranchers into signing his contracts. He's not selling them new water. He's stealing their own water and selling it back to them. The phantom rain on the roof suddenly sounded. To Coulter, like handfuls of gravel being thrown by a cheat, he finally understood. His own gauge, the one he kept at the creek's edge on his property line, had been dropping steadily for 6 months. The water level in his own well, which had never failed Martha's father, was now alarmingly low. He had blamed the sky. He had blamed God. But the culprit was a man in a pinstripe suit. Kincaid hadn't just bought the upstream reservoir. As the rumor went, he had stolen the water that fed it. This woman, this stranger, hadn't just brought trouble to his ranch. She had brought the answer. "He found out I knew," Alara whispered, the last of her energy draining away, leaving her pale and trembling. "The clerk I replaced, I don't think he just left town. Kincaid was in his office. I heard him telling Rusk to find the girl and recover the company property. He didn't mean me. He meant the map. I grabbed the map, the real ledger, and I ran. I've been running for 3 days." The silence that followed was absolute. Coulter stared at the satchel, at the thin canvas separating a valley from its ruin. He looked at this woman, who had traded her life for a piece of paper. He had lived as a shadow for 4 years, content to let the world turn, content to be left alone. That world was now gone. The new day dawned hard and bright, a sharp, white light that offered no relief. The wind had not died. It had merely paused to gather its strength. Coulter had spent the remaining hours of the night in his chair, the carbine resting across his lap, while Alara slept fitfully, bundled in his coat on the floor by the stove. He was outside, checking the stock, when he saw the rider. It was a single man, not a posse, approaching from the direction of town, moving at a steady, deliberate pace. Coulter's hand went to the pistol on his hip. He watched from the shadow of the barn until the man was close enough to recognize. Jonah Pike. The blacksmith was a big man, built like his own anvils, his face permanently smudged with soot and creased with a pragmatic worry. He was the closest thing Coulter had to a friend, which meant they spoke perhaps 4 times a year. For him to ride out to Ortega Ridge unannounced meant the world was on fire. Jonah pulled his horse up, his eyes darting to the house, then back to Coulter. He didn't dismount. "Coulter!" "Jonah!" "Town's in a stir," Jonah said, wasting no time. "One of Rusk's men was at the distillery saloon late last night, drunk and running his mouth. Said they'd chased a thief out past the Silver Thread, but had to pull up when the hermit of Ortega Ridge took her in." There it was, the rumor. Coulter's face remained a mask of stone. "The talk is ugly," Jonah continued, his discomfort clear. "You know how people are. A lone woman at your ranch in the dead of night. They're painting her as a saloon girl, a fugitive, or worse. Kincaid's money is fueling the talk. Rusk is making sure it spreads." "And," Coulter asked, his voice quiet, "and Mabel Tansey is trying to fight it." Jonah shook his head, a look of frustrated admiration on his face. "The schoolmarm. She's got it in her head to file a petition against Kincaid. Been trying to get folks to sign it for a week, demanding the territory look into the water allotments. But she's got no proof. It's all rumor and suspicion. No one will sign." Coulter stated. It wasn't a question. "They're terrified," Jonah said, leaning forward on his saddle horn. "The cattle drive is in 2 weeks. The herds are thin, the grass is gone, and the creek's a mud puddle. Kincaid is the only one with water to sell. Everyone knows Rusk is just waiting for someone to step out of line. Signing Mabel's paper is suicide. And now, with this rumor about you and the woman, Rusk is using it. He's saying any proof that comes forward now is just slander from a disgraced woman and the widower who took her in. Jonah's gaze was heavy. They've poisoned the well. Coulter, before she can even speak. They've destroyed her name, and yours with it. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder, though not a single shot had been fired. It was a social execution, swift and bloodless. Ilara's proof. The map in her satchel was now just the word of a fallen woman. Rusk is enjoying it. Jonah finished, gathering his reins. He's letting the talk fester. He'll likely ride out here this afternoon, officially, to inquire about a fugitive. He'll come with a warrant and half a dozen men. He won't be coming to talk. Coulter nodded once, a slow, final motion. I'm obliged, Jonah. Be careful. Coulter, Kincaid's not just playing for land anymore. He's playing for all of it. The blacksmith turned his horse and rode away, a solitary figure returning to a town that was already lost. Coulter went back inside. Ilara was awake, standing by the window, her hand on the frame. She had heard it all. The hope that had flickered in her eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, hard despair. I'm sorry, Coulter, she whispered. I've ruined you. I should leave. I'll give myself up. No. His voice was iron. He walked past her, to the map on his own wall. He stared at it, not as a rancher, but as a strategist. Dry Willow was a lost cause. The town was Kincaid's. The law there was Rusk. He's hemmed us in, Coulter said, his finger tracing a line on the map. Away from Dry Willow, away from the flatlands. He traced a rugged, unforgiving path eastward, through the spine of the mountains. He controls the town. He controls the roads. And now he controls the narrative. Then what's left? She asked, her voice hollow. The territory, Coulter said. He turned to face her. His decision made, the 4 years of solitary fog had burned away, leaving a man of sharp, clear purpose. Kincaid's power ends at the county line. Rusk's warrant is just paper in Santa Mesa. The town is lost. The fight isn't here. He pointed to a name on the map. Santa Mesa, the territorial seat. Judge Bram. Coulter said, he's an old man, hard as nails, and he's one of the few men left who Kincaid hasn't bought. He answers to the governor, not to a distillery owner. Ilara looked at the map, her eyes tracing the route. It was treacherous. That's 50 miles. And the main road, Rusk will be watching it. We're not taking the main road. Coulter's finger moved to a thin, jagged line that cut between two massive rock formations. A pass so narrow it looked like a crack in the world. That's Crow's Mouth, she breathed, her eyes wide. The stories, they say it's barely a mule track, that it's crawling with ambushes, rock slides, and ghosts. Coulter finished for her. It's the last place Rusk would expect anyone to ride. He thinks we're trapped here, waiting for him to knock. He's wrong. He walked to the back door and took down 2 heavy saddlebags from a peg. He tossed one to her. It landed on the table with a heavy, leathern thump. Kincaid lit the fire, Coulter said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Rusk is fanning the flames. They think they've got us surrounded by a wildfire of rumor and fear. He pulled his carbine from the corner, checking the action with a smooth, practiced shk-shk that was the deadliest sound Ilara had ever heard. We're not going to burn. We're going to take your proof, and we're going to ride through the heart of it. He met her gaze, his own eyes as clear and cold as the water they were fighting for. We ride for Santa Mesa. The dawn broke not with color, but with a cold, gray dilution of the night. It was a mean light, thin and revealing. Coulter Hale had been moving for an hour in the pre-dawn dark, his motions economical and sure. He didn't waste energy on words. He saddled his own horse, a powerful bay, and a calmer, steady-footed mare for Ilara. She watched him from the kitchen doorway, wearing the coarse homespun shirt, her own mended dress underneath. She had washed her face at the pump. The icy water a shock that brought a false, stinging life to her skin. The canvas satchel was in her hand, the strap wrapped twice around her wrist. Coulter finished with the horses and came to her. He was carrying a roll of oilcloth, his worn saddlebags, and 2 canteens. He took the satchel from her. "What's in it?" "The ledger, the map. All of it." His voice was low, skeptical. "Yes, everything I took." He shook his head. "No, Rusk's men are hunters. They'll chase the prize. We don't put the prize all in one basket." He went inside to the table. In the lamplight, he unrolled the oilcloth. He separated the contents of her bag, the thick, damning ledger Kincaid had hidden, and the crucial, hand-drawn geological map. These he wrapped in the oilcloth, a tight, waterproof bundle. This he slid deep into his own saddlebag, underneath a coil of rope, a box of cartridges, and a heavy slab of jerky. The other items, Alara's original clerk's ledger, old receipts, and decoy papers he put back into her canvas satchel. "You carry this," he said, handing the satchel back to her. "You carry it like it's your life. If they catch us, you drop it. You let them have it. It'll buy us time." She understood. She was the decoy. He then handed her a battered straw hat. "The sun will burn you blind out there." He paused, then held out a pair of worn but well-oiled leather gloves. They were small, clearly made for a woman. "These were my wife's, Martha. She had a garden." He looked at Alara's bandaged wrist, his gaze unsentimental but not unkind. "You're not used to rains. They'll take the skin off your hands by noon." She would have wanted them used. Alara pulled them on. They were soft, supple, and fit as if they were her own. For a moment, she felt a profound, aching connection to a woman she had never known, a woman whose life had been lived in this isolated, quiet house. She flexed her fingers, the leather a new, strong skin. "Let's ride," Coulter said, turning away from the memory. They mounted, Coulter sliding his carbine into the scabbard by his knee. He gave a low whistle, and the old dog, Gus, materialized from the shadows of the porch, trotting ahead. They didn't take the trail to Dry Willow. They didn't take the main road to Santa Mesa. Coulter turned the horses east, straight into the rising, hostile glare of the sun, toward the broken, rocky spine of the mountains. Their route led them through the basin of thorns. It was a miles-wide expanse of hostile vegetation, a sea of skeletal ocotillo, dagger-like yucca, and the grasping, barbed hooks of catclaw acacia. The thorns screeched against their leather chaps and the horses' legs, a constant, irritating shrub that set Alara's teeth on edge. The horses hated it, tossing their heads, their steps nervous and quick. It was a hard, slow, painful way to travel. But as Coulter had intended, it was a path no one would willingly take. As they finally cleared the basin and began the ascent into the first canyons, Alara saw it. To the south, in a valley that should have been empty, a thin, greasy pillar of smoke climbed into the pale sky. It wasn't a campfire. It was too large, too deliberate. "Rusk?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Coulter's face was grim. He didn't look at the smoke, but at the ground ahead. His men, they're not just waiting at the ranch. They're not just watching the roads. They're sweeping the territory, burning out the arroyos, flushing any squatters or ranchers who might give us water or shelter. They're making the land itself our enemy. The smoke was a message. Written in ash, there is nowhere to hide. They entered the narrow pass that was the prelude to Crow's Mouth. The world shrank from a vast, thorny plain to a claustrophobic corridor of red rock. The walls rose 100 feet on either side, the sun only a sliver of light far above. The horses' hooves echoed, the sound unnaturally loud, as if announcing their presence to the entire world. Gus, the old dog, trotted ahead, his nose to the ground, a silent, gray scout. The shot came from nowhere. The crack of the rifle was a physical blow, echoing and amplifying a dozen times between the canyon walls. It was followed an instant later by the high, angry zzz of a bullet ricocheting off the rock face, just inches from Ilara's head. "Off now!" Coulter's voice was not a shout. It was an explosion. He didn't wait for her to obey. He grabbed the bridle of her mare, yanking the horse's head down, and simultaneously shoved Ilara hard in the shoulder. She fell, not cleanly, but in a clumsy, panicked tangle of limbs, tumbling from the saddle and landing hard on the rocky ground. Coulter was off his own horse a second later, dragging her and the panicked mare behind a massive, jutting sandstone boulder that offered the only cover. Another shot, this one thudding into the boulder, sending splinters of red rock stinging their faces. "Stay down," Coulter hissed. He unslung his carbine, eased his head around the edge of the rock, and fired a single, quick shot back up the canyon. He wasn't aiming to hit, he was aiming to make them pause. "Who is it?" Ilara gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs, her shoulders screaming from the impact. "3 of them," Coulter said, his voice deadly calm. "And a buckboard. Rusk's men. They must have been waiting for us." Ilara peeked around the rock. Farther up the narrow pass, a light spring wagon was angled across the path, blocking it. 2 men were using it as cover, their rifles resting on the wagon's side. A third man was trying to control their agitated horses. "They've got us pinned," Coulter muttered. "We're trapped between them and the basin. What do we do?" Coulter looked at the narrow, twisting walls. Then he looked at Gus, who was crouched beside him, trembling with a predator's excitement, his gaze fixed on his master. Coulter put his hand on the dog's head. "They're waiting for us to run back. We can't go back." He looked at a narrow, almost invisible split in the rock wall to their left, a side canyon barely wide enough for a single horse. "We go through." He gave Gus a low, complex command, a series of soft whistles and hand gestures. The dog seemed to understand instantly. "Wait for my signal," Coulter whispered to Ilara. "When I shoot, you mount up. You don't wait for me. You ride for that gap. Don't stop. Don't look back." "Coulter, no." "Do it." He took aim, his whole body still. "Now, Gus." The old dog, with a sudden burst of youthful energy, broke from cover, but he didn't run toward the men. He bolted in the opposite direction, back the way they had come, out into the open, barking furiously as if he were chasing a rabbit. What's the dog doing?" one of the gunmen yelled, distracted. "It's a trick," another shouted. But it was too late. Their attention was split. Coulter leaned out and fired twice, not at the men, but at the rock face just above their heads. The shot sent a shower of stone chips and stinging dust down onto their position. Now, Ilara ride. He vaulted into his own saddle as Ilara, clumsy with fear and adrenaline, scrambled onto her mare. She kicked the horse's flanks, her heart in her throat. Coulter fired again, keeping the men's heads down. They plunged toward the narrow side canyon, a desperate, frantic dash. The men recovered, their rifles cracking. Bullets whined past Ilara's ears, but the buckboard was gaining on them. The side canyon was a dead end, a shallow box. They were trapped. No, the wagon wasn't gaining on them. It was chasing them into the box canyon. It was a trap. "Coulter!" she screamed. But Coulter had seen it. He reined his horse in so hard it nearly fell. The buckboard, coming fast, was now blocking the only exit. The 3 men were laughing. They had them. "It's over! Hail!" one of them yelled, leveling his rifle. "The rifle!" Coulter shouted, yanking his carbine from its scabbard and shoving it at Ilara. "I need my hands, take it!" "I don't know how," she cried, her hands fumbling with the heavy steel and wood. "He's blocking my shot, I have to move the horses," Coulter yelled. He grabbed her mare's reins, pulling both horses into a tight, frantic circle. "Just point it at the wagon, aim for the front wheel, pull the trigger." The man on the buckboard raised his rifle. Ilara, crying in frustration and terror, lifted the heavy carbine. It was impossibly heavy. She tried to aim, but her arms were shaking. She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The recoil slammed the rifle stock back into her shoulder, the same one she had landed on, and a new, sickening pain shot through her. "You missed, girly," the man laughed. "Again," Coulter roared, still fighting the panicked horses. "Don't close your eyes, Aim." Ilara forced her eyes open. She saw the man bringing his own rifle up, taking his time. She saw the large, spinning wooden wheel. She thought of the cold creak, of the ledger, of Coulter's bandaged hands. She put the stock against her cheek, found the sight, and pulled the trigger. This time, she saw it. A puff of dust and splinters erupted from the front left wheel of the buckboard. There was a loud, cracking snap of tortured wood. The wheel didn't just break, it collapsed, folding in on itself. The buckboard lurched violently to the left, its axle digging into the hard-packed earth. The driver was thrown, and the whole wagon slammed into the canyon wall, toppling onto its side with a crash of splintering wood and metal. "Now!" Coulter yelled. He didn't wait. He dug his heels into his bay, pulling Ilara's mare with him. They galloped past the wreckage. The men were scrambling from the overturned wagon, coughing in the cloud of thick, acrid dust and black powder smoke that suddenly filled the narrow pass. They were disoriented, their horses scattered. Coulter and Ilara didn't look back. They rode hard, leaving the chaos, the dust, and the shouts of an angry, defeated posse behind them. They rode for 2 hours, pushing the horses, their breath ragged, the adrenaline fading into a sour, trembling exhaustion. They didn't speak. The only sound was the clatter of hooves on stone and the sighing of the wind. Finally, Coulter slowed them to a walk, letting the horses breathe. They had reached a high, lonely mesa. In the center of it stood the ruins of an old adobe chapel, its bell tower a jagged, broken tooth against the sky, its roof long since collapsed. It was a place of ghosts, but it was defensible, and it offered shade from the relentless sun. "We rest here," Coulter said, dismounting. His face was a mask of trail dust. "Water the horses, just a little." As Ilara slid from the saddle, her legs shaking so badly she almost fell, the pain in her shoulder, which had been a dull throb, flared into a hot, white fire. She winced, her hand flying to the spot. When she pulled her hand away, it was sticky with blood. The recoil of the rifle, striking the same place she had fallen, had torn her skin and the shirt. Coulter saw it instantly. "Sit!" He led her into the shade of the ruined chapel walls. He took his canteen and a small leather pouch from his saddlebag. He poured a small, precious amount of water onto a clean rag. "This is going to sting," he said. He opened the pouch. It was salt. "But it'll keep the wound clean." Ilara braced herself, but she was unprepared for the sharp, searing pain as he began to clean the abrasion. She gasped, her teeth clamping down on her lip to keep from crying out. "Hold still," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Almost done." He worked with a detached, practiced efficiency. His hands, which she had seen handle a horse and a rifle with such power, were now impossibly steady, impossibly gentle. He cleaned the raw, bloody scrape on her shoulder, his touch sure, moving with a purpose that was entirely medicinal. He was focused on the wound, not on her, not on the skin his fingers brushed. Early afternoon light streamed through a collapsed section of the roof, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the still, hot air. It was silent, save for the cropping of the horses outside and the soft sound of the cloth on her skin. She watched his face, taut with concentration. She watched his broad, calloused fingers as he carefully applied the salt, his touch so deliberate, so respectful. He was touching a place of pain, but his touch itself was calming. He finished cleaning it and took a roll of linen bandage from his bag. He began to wrap her shoulder, his arm brushing her side, his fingers near her collarbone as he worked the bandage. Ilara's breath caught in her throat, a sharp, sudden intake of air. It wasn't from the pain of the wound, it was from the shock of his care. In her life, first as an orphan and then as a clerk in a man's world, she had been harassed, threatened, ignored, and hunted. She could not remember the last time anyone had touched her, not with passion, not with aggression, but with simple, decent, selfless kindness. Coulter paused, mistaking her gasp for pain.
Did I pull it too tight?
She looked at his face, so close to hers, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat, and she shook her head. Tears she hadn't known were there pricked at the back of her eyes.
No,
she whispered, her voice thick.
Thank you.
He finished tying the bandage with a practical knot, his fingers lingering for just a half-second. He met her gaze, and for the first time, he looked lost. This was territory he didn't know. He gave a curt nod and stood up, moving away, breaking the strange, fragile intimacy of the moment. He walked to the ruined archway of the chapel and stared back the way they had come, toward the distant, hazy plains. His posture was rigid. "We're not going to Santa Mesa," he said, his voice flat. Ilara, stunned, stood up. "What, Coulter? We won. We escaped. The judge is the only way." "We didn't win," he said, turning to face her, his eyes cold and hard with a new, unwelcome certainty. "We did exactly what they wanted. Rusk is a brute, but Kincaid isn't. Kincaid is smart. This wasn't a posse. It was a herding party." Herding! They weren't trying to catch us. Not really. They were trying to push us, to flush us out of the basin and force us into Crow's Mouth. They wanted us on the run, pointed east, as far from Dry Willow as possible. The terrible logic of it settled on her. While they go back for the real prize. Coulter finished, his voice like gravel. "My ranch. We left it undefended. Rusk and his men think we're running for our lives to Santa Mesa. They think they have all day. Kincaid isn't just trying to get your map. Ilara, he's making an example of me. He's burning me out." He strode to his horse, his movements angry and decisive. "He thinks I'm a widower who's forgotten how to fight. He's wrong." "We're going back," she whispered, horrified. "Back toward them. They won't be looking for us there. They'll have their backs to us." He checked his rifle, sliding it back into the scabbard. He looked up at the sky. It was no longer a pale, flat blue. The horizon to the west was a deep, bruised purple. The air was heavy, electric. He mounted his horse, a dark, resolute figure against the ruins of the chapel. He was no longer running. He was going to war. "On the way back," he said, "I smelled it." "Smelled what?" "Rain." He tilted his head, tasting the air. "It's far off, but it's coming. A big storm, swirling up from the south, holding its breath." He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "Let's hope it holds off. A fire's easier to fight in the dry." He turned his horse, not east toward the law, but west, back toward the smoke, back toward the ranch, back toward the fight he had been avoiding for 4 long years. They rode back under a bruised, churning sky, a ceiling of slate gray that pressed the heat and the silence down onto the land. The return to Ortega Ridge was nothing like the desperate flight from it. Coulter moved with a grim, calculated purpose. Skirting the main basin and using dry arroyos and low ridges as cover, the world was holding its breath. The distant, promised rain was a palpable weight in the air, a tension that mirrored the knot in Ilara's gut. They found the ranch untouched. It was a ghost property, silent, just as they had left it. Rusk and his men, confident in their ruse, had not yet arrived. The sight of the undisturbed yard, the quiet windmill, the sleeping dog Gus who rose, stretched, and wagged his tail at their return, felt like a small, undeserved miracle. But Coulter knew it was not an end. It was an intermission. Kincaid's men would be back, perhaps not with rifles, but with torches. "They'll come at night," Coulter said, his voice flat as he unsaddled his horse. "Fire is their fastest play. They'll wait until they think we're asleep, or until the wind is right." The waiting began. It was a new kind of suspense, quieter than a rifle shot, but just as taut. The ranch, once Coulter's refuge from the world, had become his fortress, and Alara, the fugitive, became its co-defender. The 4 years of Coulter's solitary life had left their mark. The ranch was functional, but only just. Things were mended with a bachelor's practicality. Enough to work, but no more. The rhythm of his life had been one of mere survival, of getting from sunup to sundown. Now, with Alara there, a new energy entered the space. She could not just sit and wait for the inevitable. Her mind, trained in the meticulous order of ledgers, craved work.
I can't just wait,
she said the first morning, her hands twisting in the folds of the homespun shirt.
Show me what to do. I won't be a burden.
Coulter looked at her soft clerk's hands, one of which was still bandaged. He saw the stubborn pride in her eyes, the same spark he'd seen at the gate. He gave a single nod. "The stock needs water, troughs low." He didn't just point, he taught. He showed her how to work the heavy, squealing handle of the pump, how to manage the weight of the sloshing wooden buckets. He showed her how to mend a split in the leather of a saddle, his large, scarred hands guiding hers as she pulled the awl and sinew through the tough hide. She was clumsy at first, her stitches uneven, but she was a quick study. She learned to tie a knot that held, to check a hoof for stones, to listen for the subtle change in the windmill's groan that meant the wind was shifting. These were small, mindless tasks, the bedrock of ranch life. But for Coulter, they were transformative. For 4 years, these chores had been a solitary ritual, a way to mark time until he could sleep. Now, they were a conversation. He found himself speaking, explaining the temperament of the mare, the best way to bank the stove's fire, the reason he mended his ropes with a particular splice. He was teaching her, and in doing so, he was hearing his own voice again, not just as a man giving orders, but as a man sharing knowledge. He was rebuilding the rhythms of his own life, whether he knew it or not. Alara, in turn, found a strange, hard peace in the labor. Her body ached. Her hands, despite the gloves, were raw and blistered. But the physical work silenced the looping, terrified thoughts in her head. She couldn't worry about Rusk's rifle when she was trying to balance 2 heavy buckets of water. She couldn't obsess over Kincaid's map when she was focused on keeping a needle straight. One afternoon, she was watering the horses. The air was still and humid, the sky a yellowish gray. She was humming a half-forgotten tune from her childhood, a simple, looping melody. She did it without thinking, a small sound to comfort herself in the oppressive quiet. Coulter was in the small smithy, ostensibly sharpening a shovel blade. The rasp of the file was loud and rhythmic, but as her humming reached him, carried on the thick air, the rasping slowed. He stopped, his head tilted, his hands resting on the tool. He just listened. Her voice was clear, untrained, and profoundly lonely. It was a sound of life, a soft, human color in his world of gray dust and brown grass. He found himself pretending to be busy, his file moving silently over the metal, just to let the sound hang in the air, to let it settle into the quiet corners of the barn before the wind or a horse's whinny could steal it. The most pressing task was the fence. The section along the creek bed his lifeline was weak, the posts rotted from the last good flood season. Years ago, if Kincaid's men drove his small herd, it would be the first place to break. "We have to replace the posts," he announced, and it was a we, not an I. They worked for hours under the strange, hostile light. Coulter dug the post holes, his muscles moving with a familiar, powerful rhythm. Alara's job was to drag the new posts into place and hold them steady while he packed the earth. The creek bank was soft. its edges muddy and slick from the dwindling water. She was struggling with a heavy cedar post, trying to angle it into the hole, when her foot slipped. She gave a small cry of surprise, not fear, as she lost her balance. She tumbled backward, landing with a thick, wet splat in a patch of deep, sucking mud. She was stunned for a second, the cold, dark ooze seeping through her dress. Then she looked at herself. She was covered, from her waist to her boots, in thick, black mud. It was absurd. She was a bookkeeper, a woman who had just fled for her life, and she was sitting in a mud puddle. A sound bubbled up in her throat. It was a laugh. It started as a small, choked gasp and grew into a full, unrestrained peal of laughter. It was the first time she had laughed in months, and the sound was as shocking as a gunshot. Coulter, who had turned, shovel in hand, froze. He stared at her, this mud-caked woman, laughing as if she hadn't a care in the world. He hadn't heard laughter on this ranch in 4 years. It's cold, she managed to say, wiping a muddy hand across her face, which only made it worse. A slow, reluctant smile cracked the hard mask of Coulter's face. It was a rusty, unused expression, but it reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "Looks like it," he said. He strode over, his own boots sinking into the bank. He held out his hand. "Come on, we've got work to do." She took his hand. It was rough, caked with dirt and calluses, and it closed around hers with an absolute, solid strength. He pulled, but the mud had a powerful suction, and he had underestimated her weight. As he heaved, his own foot slipped on a wet stone. He didn't fall, but he stumbled forward, his arm pinwheeling for balance. He caught himself, but not before he had sent a cascade of muddy water and dirt all over his own front. Now they both stood there, facing each other, barely 2 feet apart. She was covered. He was splattered. The ridiculousness of the situation, the sudden, shared baptism of mud, broke the last of the tension. He let out a low chuckle. She laughed again. They stood in the mud, by a failing creek, under a storm-heavy sky. And, for one moment, they were not a widower and a fugitive. They were just 2 people, covered in mud. That evening, the fragile truce they had built solidified. The air was too thick to stay inside. They sat on the edge of the porch, their backs against the solid adobe wall, sharing a pot of bean stew. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was companionable, filled with the shared memory of the day's work. Ilara finally broke it, her voice soft. "I wanted to be a doctor." Coulter looked at her, surprised. He had only known her as a clerk, a woman of numbers. "My mother." Ilara stared out into the twilight, where the plains were turning a deep, velvety purple. "She was sick for a long time. The doctor in our town. He was kind, but he was always tired, always overwhelmed. I used to read his books. I wanted to learn how to heal things, how to fix what was broken." She picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. "But we had no money. When she passed, I had to work. The only thing I was good at, besides sums, was my handwriting. So I became a bookkeeper. I went from wanting to mend bones to mending ledgers." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "And I found out I was very good at it. Good enough to spot a thief like Kincaid." She looked at Coulter, her gaze direct. "Sometimes I think this is all my fault. If I had just been a worse clerk, if I hadn't been so meticulous, I would be safe. You would be safe." Coulter was silent for a long time, watching the first fireflies begin to glitter over the dry grass. "You can't blame yourself for being what you are. Ilara, you saw a wrong thing, and you couldn't look away. That's not a fault. That's rare." He turned his gaze from the plains to the interior of the dark house behind him. "For 4 years, I've been looking away." He stood, went inside, and returned a moment later with a small, carved wooden box. It was dark, polished by years of handling. He sat back down, holding it on his lap. He didn't open it. "Martha, my wife," he began, his voice rough. "She was from back east. She hated this land. She hated the dust, the wind, the quiet. She said the quiet was so loud it made her head hurt." He ran a thumb over the lid of the box. "She was right to hate it. This land. It takes everything. It took her. A fever, fast and hot, just like the wind. The doctor from Santa Mesa came, but he was 3 days too late." He finally lifted the lid. Inside, resting on dark velvet, was a single object, a delicate linen handkerchief, folded into a neat square. In one corner, embroidered in blue thread, was a single letter M. "This is all that's left," he whispered. "This and the house. When she died, I stopped. I kept the cattle, I mended the fences just enough, but I wasn't living, I was just waiting. I've been a shadow in my own home for 4 years, a ghost, just like her." He looked at Alara, his eyes raw with a grief that was as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. "I told myself I was honoring her, but I wasn't. I was just hiding from this." He motioned to the ranch. "To the world. Then you showed up at my gate, half drowned in all fight. You brought Kincaid's war to my door, and it was the first thing I've felt since I put her in the ground." Alara looked at the handkerchief, at this small, fragile token of a life she never knew, a love that had anchored this man and then set him adrift. Her heart ached for him, for this quiet, strong man who had confessed his deepest wound to her. She didn't offer empty words of comfort. She didn't tell him it would be all right. Instead, she reached out, her fingers stained with mud and rope burns, gently touching the edge of the linen. Then, with a tenderness she hadn't known she possessed, she folded the lid of the box closed. It made a soft, final click. She had closed an old door, not on the memory, but on the open wound. Their eyes met in the twilight. It was a look that was no longer widower and fugitive. It was something new, complex, and charged with an awkward, undeniable warmth. It was the look of two people who had seen the hidden, broken parts of each other, and had not turned away. The moment was broken by the sound of a horse. Both were on their feet instantly. The intimacy shattered, the tension snapping back into place. Coulter's hand was on his pistol, but it was a single rider, and he was not armed for a fight. It was Jonah Pike, the blacksmith, and he was riding his horse hard. He didn't dismount. "Jonah," Coulter said, stepping off the porch. "Bad news. Coulter, real bad." Jonah's face was streaked with sweat and soot. "I just got back from the upper pass. Kincaid's not waiting. He must have known you'd be back. He's raised the temporary dam. Another 2 feet, solid rock and timber. He's not just diverting the creek anymore. He's stopped it." The blood drained from Coulter's face. "He's cut it off." "Completely," Jonah said, his voice grim. "The reservoir is full, his reservoir. But the creek bed below it, it's drying as we speak. My guess your troughs, and every other rancher's on this line, will be bone dry in a week. He's going to kill the valley. Coulter, for good." As if summoned by the news, another figure appeared, this one on foot, hurrying up the path from town. It was Mabel Tansey, the schoolteacher, her skirts hitched up, her face pale but determined. She was carrying a satchel of her own. "Jonah, Oh, Coulter! Thank heavens!" She was out of breath. "I had to come. I heard what Jonah found. We can't wait. We have to file the petition. We have to get Judge Bram." She opened her bag and pulled out a sheaf of papers. "This is the draft of the legal petition. It's all here. It details the community's claim to the public water. It cites the territorial charters, but it's useless." "Why?" Alara asked, stepping forward. "Because it's just words," Mabel said, her voice shaking with frustration. "It's my word against Silas Kincaid's. It's rumor. To get Judge Bram to even look at this, to get him to issue an injunction and ride out here, I need the proof.
The original evidence.
All eyes turned to Alara. The four of them, Coulter, Alara, Jonah, and Mabel, stood in the yard as the last light died. The air was dead. Still. The looming storm had not yet broken. "Alara," Coulter said, his voice quiet, "get the map." She went inside. The canvas satchel felt heavier than it ever had. She brought it to the porch, into the last dim light. She unwrapped the oilcloth, her hands steady now. She laid the items on the weathered porch rail. The map, the geological survey, its blue lines showing the true, public source of the Silver Thread Creek. The ledger, Kincaid's private one, its neat columns detailing payments for dam construction and rusk bonuses. And one more thing, a small, folded piece of paper she hadn't mentioned. "I found this tucked in the ledger," she said, her voice low. "It's a handwritten note. It's from Kincaid, to Rusk." She unfolded it. It was a list of names. Coulter's was on it. So was Jonah's. Next to each name was a date. Beside Coulter's date were 2 words, Ortega Ridge, burn. Mabel Tansey's hand flew to her mouth. Jonah swore, a low, vicious sound. Coulter Hale looked at the thin, flimsy pieces of paper. The map that could save a valley. The ledger that could hang a man. The note that could burn him to the ground. They were so fragile. A single spark, a gust of wind, and they would be gone. He looked at Alara, her face pale but resolute in the gloom. He looked at Jonah and Mabel, the last stubborn remnants of a town too scared to fight for itself. He looked at his ranch, the house where he had hidden from life, and he knew the time for hiding was over. The decision was no longer his to make. It had been made for him.
"Jonah,"
Coulter said, his voice hard as iron.
"Ride back to town. Tell anyone who will listen to meet here, at my ranch, at dawn. Tell them to bring shovels, and to bring their canteens. Tell them Kincaid has declared war."
"And us?" Alara asked, her hand resting on the map. Coulter looked at the damning evidence. These thin, powerful shields. "Kincaid thinks we're running to Santa Mesa. He's wrong. We're bringing Santa Mesa here." He turned to Mabel. "Your petition. Plus this, it's enough. But we have to get it to Judge Bram. And we have to defend this ranch until he comes." He looked at the sky. The fire is coming, and the rain is late. The heavy quiet that settled on Ortega Ridge after Jonah and Mabel left was thicker than the coming night. It was a silence filled with unspoken plans, with the weight of the evidence now hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the kitchen, and with the oppressive, electric humidity of the sky. The land was waiting. The ranch was waiting. Coulter and Alara moved through the evening chores in a state of shared, focused tension. They were no longer a rancher and a fugitive. They were a garrison of 2, preparing for a siege. They checked the water barrels, filled every trough, and secured the corral. Every action was precise, every word practical. Night fell, but it brought no relief. The air, instead of cooling, seemed to get heavier, clinging to the skin like wet wool. From the kitchen window, they watched the horizon. There was no moon, but the distant mountains were periodically thrown into sharp, skeletal relief by silent, flickering webs of heat lightning. The world was a tinderbox, and the sky was striking flints above it. "It's a hot wind," Coulter said, his voice a low rumble. He stood by the back door, staring out into the darkness, his frame a solid silhouette against the nervous, flickering sky. "The storm is close," Alara murmured. She was sitting at the kitchen table, the place that had become their command center. "It has to be. That rain has to come." "It's close," he agreed, "but it's not here." He turned from the door and bolted it, the heavy thud of the wood echoing in the small room. He moved to the stove and, using a poker, banked the coals. They didn't need the heat, but the low, red glow of the embers was a comfort, a small, controllable fire against the vast, uncontrolled darkness. The only other light came from the single oil lamp on the table, its yellow flame casting a steady, warm circle. In its glow, Ilara's face was etched with exhaustion, her eyes large and shadowed. He saw the faint, dark smudge of the rifle's recoil on her shoulder, visible just above the collar of her shirt. He saw the raw, healing skin on her hands, now gloved in his late wife's leather. He saw a woman who had been pushed to the edge of her world and had not broken. He sat down opposite her, the table between them a small, neutral territory. The silence stretched, filled only by the hiss of the banked coals and the low, insistent moan of the wind, which had begun to pick up, testing the house. "You should sleep," he said. "Dawn will come early, and they'll be with it." "I can't," she said, shaking her head. "My mind won't quiet. It just keeps seeing that note burn." He had no comfort to offer, no lie that would make it better. "Me too." They sat in that shared, tense silence. This was the moment before the battle, the long, drawn-out breath before the plunge. And then the wind, which had only been moaning, let out a sudden, violent shriek. It slammed into the side of the house, rattling the windows in their frames as if an angry fist were trying to break in. A powerful, cold downdraft shot through the gap under the back door. It was a river of icy air in the stifling room. The cold funnel hit the table, and the lamp flame, which had been so steady, guttered, leaped high, and was instantly extinguished. The world vanished. They were plunged into a profound, elemental darkness. The familiar, warm kitchen was gone, replaced by a void. The only light was the faint, deep red pulse from the stove's grate, a demonic, watchful eye in the black. It was not enough to see by. It was only enough to cast shadows, making the room seem vast and threatening. The wind howled again, and with it, the cold draft returned, sharp and biting. Ilara, her nerves already stretched thin, gasped at the sudden, icy touch on her skin. She shivered, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that was only half from the cold. It was the shock of the sudden darkness, the sudden, sharp reminder of the night she had arrived, cold and hunted. She felt more than saw Coulter move. He was a large shadow detaching itself from the other shadows. He crossed the few feet between them, his boots silent on the wooden floor. She tensed, her hand instinctively moving to the empty table where the map had been. He stopped beside her. He didn't speak. She heard the scrape of wool, and then a heavy, warm weight settled over her shoulders. He was draping his thick wool blanket, the one from his own cot, around her. His hands moved to her shoulders to secure it, his fingers brushing the fabric at her collar. He pulled the two edges of the blanket together in front of her, a simple, protective gesture. But his hands, large and warm from the stove, lingered. His fingers, calloused and strong, brushed the side of her neck as he tucked the blanket closed, and the accidental, fleeting touch sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with fear. His hands stilled. He had felt it too. He didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers unconsciously tightened their grip on the blanket, a small, convulsive motion that pulled her just an inch closer to his warmth. He was a solid, living wall of heat against the cold, invasive draft. She was surrounded by his scent-old leather, wood smoke, and the faint, clean smell of the sage tea he drank. It was the scent of the ranch, the scent of safety. Her voice, when she spoke, was a ragged whisper, a truth forced out of her by the darkness and the sudden, overwhelming sensation of his closeness. "It's been so long." He froze, his hands still on the blanket at her shoulders. "No one's touched me like this," she breathed, the words barely audible over the wind. Not in kindness, not in, I don't remember." The admission hung in the dark, red-lit air. It was a confession of a loneliness so deep it had become a part of her, a loneliness she hadn't even had time to acknowledge until this moment. Coulter's breath caught. He understood. This wasn't the plea of a frightened woman. It was the statement of a parched soul. He, who had lived as a ghost for 4 years, recognized the sound of a life starved of human contact. The small space between them was no longer a void. It was a humming, living thing. He could feel the warmth of her breath through the homespun shirt. She could feel the solid, steady presence of his chest, inches from her face. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, he leaned down. She felt his breath stir the hair at her temple. She didn't move. She didn't pull away. She didn't breathe at all. This, she realized, was what she had been running toward, not just away from. The distance between them closed. Their breaths mingled. One, then the other. He was so close, and still. He waited. The first kiss was not a kiss at all. It was a hesitant, gentle pressure, a question. His lips, dry and warm, brushed hers, a touch as light as the heat lightning on the horizon. It was a test, a promise, a thing that could be taken back. He pulled back, just a fraction. It was the smallest movement, but in the dark, it was a chasm. He was asking, even now, in this moment, he was giving her the choice. His silence was a question, is this all right? Ilara's answer was not a word. She let out the breath she had been holding, a soft, trembling sigh, and leaned her head forward. Just that fraction of an inch he had given her. It was a quiet, absolute yes. That was all. The promise was accepted. His mouth met hers again, and this time, it was not a question. It was an answer. The kiss was slow, deep, and as discreet as a prayer. It was a kiss of profound, staggering relief. It held no desperation, no urgent hunger, but a deep, shared recognition. It tasted of the bitter sage tea and the dust of the trail, but beneath it was a sweetness, an anchor. It was the kiss of two people who had been alone for so long they had forgotten what it felt like to not be. His hand, which had been gripping the blanket, moved. His calloused, rough fingers slid from the wool to the skin of her neck, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that made her eyes sting. She raised her own hand, no longer a clerk's hand, but a ranch hand's, scarred and raw, and laid it on the hard muscle of his chest. She felt his heart, a strong, steady, living beat beneath her palm. He broke the kiss, but he didn't move away. They stayed there, foreheads touching, breathing the same air in the pulsing red dark. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed the back door against its bolt, the crack making Ilara jump. The cold draft swirled around their ankles. "It's too cold here." Coulter's voice was a low, rough murmur, thick with an emotion she had never heard. He didn't wait for her to stand. He slid one arm behind her back, the other under her knees. He lifted her. She made a small, surprised sound, her arms looping around his neck, her face buried in the warm curve of his shoulder. He had lifted her as if she weighed nothing. He moved them away from the drafty, vulnerable door, crossing the small kitchen in 3 long strides. He carried her to the long, low bench that ran against the hearth, the warmest, safest place in the house. The glow from the stove's grate was brighter here, painting them in strokes of deep crimson and shadow. He sat, settling her on his lap. The wool blanket still pooled around her. He didn't release her. He held her, his arms a fortress against the howling wind and the world outside. He looked at her, his face illuminated by the fire's pulse. He was seeing her, really seeing her, and his eyes were full of a raw, quiet awe. He kissed her again, and this time the kiss was different. The initial discovery was over. This was a homecoming. His calloused hands moved with a reverent, measured purpose, sliding from her shoulders down her back, pulling her closer, molding her against the solid, comforting strength of his body. The scene, from then on, was a thing of shadow and firelight, of silent, shared understandings. The world shrank to the small, warm space in front of the hearth. The only sounds were the rising shriek of the wind, a lonely, desperate counterpoint to the quiet intimacy within, and the steady, rhythmic crackle of the embers in the stove. His hands, so sure and strong, were a map of gentle discovery on her skin. He traced the line of her collarbone, his touch respectful, hesitant, and then, as she leaned into him, more confident. He was unlearning 4 years of solitude. She, in turn, felt the tension of her long flight finally, completely, unwind. The hard shell of the fugitive, the meticulous clerk, dissolved, leaving only the woman beneath who had been hidden for so long. The wool blanket slid from her shoulders to the floor. Forgotten. The coarse linen of his shirt was abrasive against her cheek, but the warmth of the man beneath it was a profound comfort. Their hands found each other, fingers lacing together, his calloused palm enveloping hers, a tight, unbreakable grip. The firelight danced. It leaped across the log walls, making the shadows on the ceiling sway and bend, as if they were alive. It caught the moisture in her eyes, turning it to gold. It highlighted the hard line of his jaw, the deep, quiet intensity in his gaze. It was a worldless, sacred space, built of shared warmth and mutual respect. They were shedding not just their loneliness, but their armor, finding in each other a solace the hostile land had refused to grant. Later, how much later, neither of them knew. They lay on the bench, tangled in the blanket. The fire in the stove had burned down to a low, steady pulse. The wind outside had quieted, its rage spent, settling into a low, mournful sigh. Ilara was curled against Coulter's side, her head on his chest. His arms were locked around her, his chin resting on the top of her head. They were still. He shifted, and she looked up. He looked down at her. Their faces were inches apart. A slow, tired, disbelieving smile touched his lips. It was the first true smile she had ever seen from him, and it transformed his harsh features into something entirely new. She smiled back, a mirroring expression of breathless, quiet joy. He leaned down and rested his forehead against hers. They just breathed, a shared, easy rhythm. The fear was gone. The loneliness was gone. For the first time, in this small, besieged ranch house, two solitary, broken people felt as if they finally, completely, belonged. "Ilara," he whispered, the first words spoken in an hour. "Coulter," she whispered back. It was all that needed to be said. Outside, the great bruised clouds that had promised so much, the storm that had held the valley in its grip, began to break apart. It was a final, cruel betrayal by the sky. The massive, churning weather system slid past them, moving east, its edges lit by the departing heat lightning. The storm, and all its precious water, had passed them by. Not a single drop of rain had fallen on the parched, waiting land of Ortega Ridge. It was a test and a verdict. The heavens would offer no deliverance. They were on their own. And as they lay there, in the first true peace they had known, Coulter's gaze drifted to the window. The false dawn was still an hour away, but in the far distance, down in the valley that led toward Dry Willow, a new light appeared. It was not the white, clean flicker of lightning. It was a small, orange pinprick, then another and another, a gathering of stars that had fallen to earth. Torches. His arms tightened around Ilara, a sudden, protective clench. She felt the change in him and looked up. Following his gaze, she saw them too, a cluster of lights, moving, organizing. "They're meeting," she whispered, the peace shattering, the cold seeping back in. "They're planning," Coulter said, his voice a low, hard growl. The man who had been resurrected by her touch was gone, replaced by the warrior. "They're planning the accident for the morning." He looked down at her, his face a hard mask in the dying ember light. They had found each other, but the world was still baying at the gate, and the dawn was coming. The peace of the false dawn was a fragile, hollow thing. It was not broken by the arrival of Rusk's men, but by a smell. It was a scent that every plainsman dreaded more than a blizzard, the sharp, acrid tang of dry grass burning. Coulter was on his feet, pulling on his boots, before Ilara had even registered the change in the air. He unbolted the kitchen door and stepped out onto the porch. The world to the east, where the sun should be, was a pale, sickly gray, but the world to the north, over the low hills, was a terrible, vibrant orange. A thick column of greasy black smoke was climbing into the sky, blotting out the stars, a funeral pyre for the land. Kincaid had not waited for dawn. He had used the cover of night to light his fuse. "He's done it," Ilara whispered, coming to stand beside him. The heat lightning of the night before had been a mockery. This was the real, man-made fire. Coulter's face was carved from granite. "He lit it in the Cinder Hills. The wind is from the north. He's not just aiming for me, Ilara. He's aiming to burn out the entire valley. Every rancher who hasn't signed his papers, he'll drive them down to Dry Willow, homeless, with the cattle drive a week away. He'll buy their land for the price of a drink." He was wrong about one thing. As he spoke, the wind, which had been a steady northern breeze, seemed to die. The silence was absolute. Even the windmill ceased its groaning. And then, a new, hot breath of air touched their faces. It came from the east. The massive column of smoke, a mile away, shuddered. It leaned, and then it began to move. Not south down the valley, but west, directly, inexorably, toward Ortega Ridge. "He's got the devil's own luck," Coulter said, his voice a low, vicious growl. "Or he waited for this wind. It's coming for us." "Coulter!" A shout from the darkness. 2 wagons were rattling up the trail, moving fast. It was Jonah Pike, with Mabel Tansey beside him, and another wagon with 2 ranchers, the Miller brothers, their faces grim. They had answered the call. They had come, not as a posse, but as neighbors, carrying shovels, axes, and water barrels. "We saw the glow," Jonah yelled, pulling his team to a halt. "It's moving fast. Where do we make the stand?" There was no time for introductions or thanks. Coulter was already in command, his 4 years of foggy grief burned away by the approaching inferno. He was a general on a field of battle he knew by heart. "The northern fence," he roared over the rising sound. The fire was no longer a distant glow. It was a living, breathing thing. It had a voice, a deep, crackling roar that was growing louder by the second. "Jonah, you and the Millers, get the plows from the barn. We need a fire break. Now, Mabel, you're with me. Wet the blankets, the feed sacks, anything we have." The small group exploded into frantic, purposeful action. The world shrank to this single, desperate task. The sun rose, but it was invisible, a dim red smear behind a suffocating pall of smoke. The air turned hot, filled with a snow of white ash. Jonah and the Millers wrestled the heavy plows, their teams of mules straining as they tore a deep, dark line of earth 50 yards north of the ranch house. They were creating a wound in the land, a patch of bare dirt that they prayed the fire could not jump. Coulter and Mabel worked like demons, soaking burlap sacks in the precious, dwindling water from the troughs. The heat was scorching, a physical blow that stole the breath. Sparks, carried on the hot wind, began to land around them, small, angry embers that started a dozen new, smaller fires in the dry grass inside their perimeter. Ilara knew her place. She was not strong enough for the plows, not fast enough for the line, but she could move water. The well was their only hope. She grabbed the bridles of Coulter's bay and her own mare, secured the empty barrels to the pack saddles, and ran them to the well. The pump handle was a cruel, relentless enemy. Her arms, already aching from the day before, screamed in protest,
Her shoulder, where the rifle had bruised her, was a map of fire, but she pumped. The water that came up was slow, muddy, a pathetic stream. Kincaid's dam had choked the aquifer, but it was water. She filled the barrels, her heart hammering with the effort, and led the horses at a run back toward the fire line. The smoke was a thick, yellow-gray wall. She couldn't see the house. She could only hear the shouts of the men and the roar of the approaching flames. "Water!" she screamed, her throat raw. Coulter emerged from the smoke, his face black with soot, his eyes red and streaming. He grabbed a bucket, dumped it over 2 sacks, and handed the dripping, steaming bundles to Mabel and one of the Miller brothers, who ran back into the fray, beating at the smaller fires that had jumped the line. "More!" Coulter yelled at her. "As fast as you can." She ran back to the well, again and again. The ranch became a blur of smoke, ash, and the agonizing rhythmic squeal of the pump. She was a machine, driven by a single thought: water. The fire line was a vision of hell. The flames were 20 feet high, a solid, rolling wall of orange that consumed everything in its path. The heat was so intense it was painful to breathe. Coulter, Jonah, and the others worked in the choking smoke, their faces wrapped in wet cloths, using the soaked sacks to beat at the edges of the fire. A desperate, seemingly futile battle against a monster. On her 4th trip, Ilara was leading the mare, the barrels dangerously full. The horse, terrified by the sound and the smell, shied at a large, falling ember. The pack saddle shifted, and one of the heavy barrels tipped, its contents sloshing, threatening to spill. "No!" Ilara cried, grabbing at the barrel, her gloves slipping on the wet wood. It was too heavy. She was going to lose it all. A shadow loomed out of the thick, billowing smoke. It was Coulter. He had seen her struggle. He slammed into her, his body shielding her from the worst of the heat, and grabbed the barrel with both hands. "I've got it!" he yelled, his voice raw. His hands closed over hers, pinning them to the barrel's leather strap. They stood there for a single, frozen second, locked together in the heart of the inferno. His face, inches from hers, was a mask of soot, sweat, and raw determination. His eyes, clear and blue, met hers through the stinging haze. In that moment, there was no past, no fear, no Kincaid. There was only the two of them. Their hands joined, their wills united, fighting for this one patch of ground. He wasn't just saving the ranch. He was saving her. She wasn't just carrying water. She was his partner. He steadied the barrel, gave her a single, hard nod, and plunged back into the smoke, leaving the imprint of his grip burning on her hands. The fight raged. They were losing. The firebreak, which had seemed so wide, was too narrow. The wind was too strong. Embers were landing on the roof of the barn. "We're not going to hold it," Jonah yelled, throwing down a smoldering sack. "It's too much." And then, as if summoned by their despair, new riders appeared. 4 men on horseback, trotting calmly through the smoke from the direction of Dry Willow. They were not carrying shovels. They were carrying rifles. At their lead was Deputy Rusk, his tin star gleaming dully in the hellish orange light. They didn't ride to the fire line. They rode straight to Ilara, who was at the well, her hands bleeding, trying to pump one last barrel. They formed a line between her and the fire, cutting her off from Coulter and the others. "Well, well," Rusk said, his voice a mocking drawl. He dismounted, walking casually toward her. "Looks like you folks are having a little trouble." Coulter, Jonah, and the Millers saw them and staggered out of the smoke, their tools in hand, their chests heaving. "Rusk," Coulter snarled, "get your men on that line, or get out of the way." "Now, Coulter, that's no way to talk to the law." Rusk sneered. He held up a piece of paper. "I'm afraid I can't let you do that. This here is a new county ordinance, effective immediately, signed by Judge Pro Tem Kincaid." "What are you talking about?"
Rusk? Mabel demanded, stepping forward, her face a mixture of soot and fury. It's a strict emergency rationing of all well water, Rusk announced, his voice loud enough for all to hear. Given the drought, all private wells are hereby under county authority, and I see a whole lot of unauthorized usage. He pointed at the barrels. You're wasting county property, folks. I'm afraid I'm going to have to impound your well. He was going to let the ranch burn. He was using the color of law to stop them, to stand by and watch as Kincaid's fire finished the job. His 3 men fanned out, their hands resting on their pistols. The ranchers were trapped. Between them was Rusk's armed posse. Behind them, the fire roared. Now just 30 yards from the barn, the heat an unbearable wave. You can't, Elara said, her voice quiet. Oh, I can, Missy. Rusk smiled, enjoying his power. It's the law. No, Elara said, her voice hardening. She dropped the pump handle and walked forward, pushing past the mare. She stopped 10 feet from Rusk. She reached into the pocket of her dress, the one she wore under Coulter's borrowed shirt. Is this the ordinance you mean, deputy? She asked, her voice ringing with a cold clarity that cut through the roar of the fire. She unfolded a single, small piece of paper, Kincaid's handwritten note. She held it up for him to see. Rusk's smile froze. Ortega Ridge, burn. Elara read, her voice climbing. Is this the new law you're enforcing, the one your boss wrote for you? The color drained from Rusk's face. His bravado, his authority, evaporated in the scorching heat. He recognized the paper. He recognized the handwriting. He was caught, exposed. His orders read aloud in front of witnesses. His men hesitated, their confidence shattered, looking from Rusk to the small, soot-covered woman who had just checkmated him. And in that moment of stunned silence, Mabel Tansey, who had been standing by the wagon, lifted the bulky, polished wooden box she had protected all morning. She aimed the brass lens at the tableau at Rusk, pale and guilty, at Elara, defiant, holding the note, at the gunmen, trapped in their own uncertainty. There was a sharp click, followed by the bright, percussive hiss of the magnesium flash. The sudden, blinding white light made everyone flinch, freezing the moment in silver and shadow. Mabel Tansey had her proof. Before Rusk could even find his voice to curse, a new sound tore the air. It was Gus, the old dog, who had been hiding under the porch. He let out a deep, frantic, warning howl. The wind, which had been a steady, hot river, shrieked. It changed. In an instant, the hot breath from the east died, and a new, cold wind slammed into them from the west. The wall of fire, which had been moments from consuming the barn, shuddered. It stalled, and then, with a terrifying whoosh, it turned. The entire northern flank of the wildfire, a mile long, swung around, pivoting on itself. It was now aimed directly at the spot where Rusk and his gunmen sat on their horses. Rusk's face, pale with guilt, turned white with raw, animal terror. The fire he had come to watch was now coming for him. "Move!" he screamed, scrambling for his horse. "It's turning, run!" He didn't wait for his men. He yanked his horse's head around and spurred it, fleeing back toward Dry Willow, the fire at his heels. His gunmen, their authority a joke, scattered like quail, pushing past each other in their panic to escape the trap. The wind shift had saved the ranch house, but it had pushed the fire straight at the northern fence line, the very fire break the men had been digging. "Now!" Coulter roared, galvanized. "To the break, all of you! It's our last chance!" The small group, their feud with Rusk forgotten, ran to the line of dark, plowed earth. The fire hit it with a sound like a freight train. It was a final, desperate battle. They used the last of the well water. They beat at the flames with their shovels. They smothered embers with their own bodies, using the singeing, smoking sacks. The flames licked the cedar posts of the fence, turning them black in an instant. The heat was a physical, blistering wall. But the plowed earth held, the fire, starved of fuel, leaped, sputtered, and, finding nothing to consume, began to die. They had held. They stood, a small, exhausted, blackened group of survivors, leaning on their shovels, their lungs aching, in a world that was now black and gray. The air stank of ash and scorched earth. The sun was a dull red coin in a sky the color of a fresh bruise. Ortega Ridge, scorched and scarred at its edges, was still standing. Jonah Pike, his face a mask of soot, walked slowly into the smoking, blackened grass where the fire had first hit their property. He poked at the still smoldering ground with his boot.
"Coulter!"
he called, his voice rough. He kicked something, a metal object that rolled out of the ashes. He knelt, wincing, and used a wet sack to pick it up. It was a 5-gallon can, singed and blackened, but on its side, in faint, blistered red letters, they could all read the words Kincaid Distillery Company and turpentine. It was the accelerant. It was the smoking gun. Ilara walked into the house, which smelled of smoke and fear. She knelt, lifted the loose floorboard, and pulled out the oilcloth bundle. She brought it outside, into the gray, ashen light. She added the singed, handwritten note. Then, she took the oily rag from Jonah and wrapped the turpentine can in it. She placed it all together. The map, the ledger, the letter, the can, the entire damning case. She wrapped the waxed cloth around it all, tying the knot with her raw, steady hands. Coulter watched her. He looked at Jonah, at Mabel, at the Miller brothers, these few brave people who had stood with him.
"It's over,"
Jonah said, his voice hollow.
"He's lost. He's exposed,"
Coulter said, his voice hard as iron.
"But he's not finished. He still holds the water. He still has Rusk. And now he's desperate."
He turned and looked at Ilara, at the bundle in her hands.
"Now for the court. Now for Bram."
Mabel nodded, her face set. "I'll ride to Santa Mesa. I'll take the petition and the camera plate. I'll get the U.S. Marshal."
"No,"
Coulter said.
"They'll be looking for you. They'll be looking for a lone woman. They won't stop you."
He looked at Ilara.
"We'll go. We'll take the evidence. All of it."
"They'll be watching the main road," Ilara said. The realization dawned on her. The cold, hard necessity.
"We're not taking the main road,"
Coulter said, his gaze already turning east, toward the jagged, hostile pass.
"Jonah, you and the Millers hold the ranch. Watch for hot spots. We'll be back."
He looked at Ilara. The truce, the peace, the shared warmth of the night was over. The fight had just begun. "We have to go through Crow's Mouth, again." "I know," she said, clutching the bundle. "We'll meet at the Santa Mesa courthouse tomorrow, noon." The Santa Mesa Territorial Courthouse was not a place of grandeur. It was a simple, 2-story wooden building that smelled of dry rot, old paper, and the nervous sweat of 50 souls packed into a space meant for 20. Dust motes danced like frantic spirits in the thick, yellow beams of sunlight that lanced through the tall, grimy windows. The air was hot, still, and charged with a tension that was almost a physical presence. The entire room seemed to creak and groan under the weight of a valley's worth of hope and fear. Farmers and ranchers, their faces burned by the sun and etched with worry, stood shoulder to shoulder, their worn work clothes a stark contrast to the polished wood of the judge's bench. They were a silent, anxious choir, waiting for the sermon to begin. The doors swung open, and a path cleared as if by an invisible force. Silas Kincaid strode in. He was dressed in a fine, dark woolen suit, ridiculously hot for the season, but it projected an aura of wealth and untouchable power. Beside him was his lawyer, a man named Sterling, imported from back east. Sterling was a stark slash of black and white in the sea of dusty brown. His suit was immaculate, his shirt front impossibly white, and his face held a look of bored, condescending superiority. He carried a polished leather briefcase as if it were a holy text. And behind them, a step to the left, was Deputy Rusk. He was a shadow in his own right, a creature of pure, simmering malice. His uniform was rumpled. His face was still smudged with soot from the fire, and his eyes, small and hard, darted around the room, promising retribution. He was a caged animal, and the courtroom was his cage. On the other side of the room stood Coulter Hale and Alara Wynne. Coulter was a pillar of stillness, his face unreadable, his gaze fixed on the judge's empty chair. Alara, beside him, clutched the oilcloth-wrapped bundle of evidence, her knuckles white. She looked small and fragile in her mended dress, yet her posture was rigid, her chin held high. She was terrified, but she was not broken. The side door opened, and Judge Bram entered. He was a small, gnarled man who looked as if he had been carved from a piece of sun-dried mesquite. His hair was a white, chaotic mess, and his face was a roadmap of wrinkles, but his eyes, beneath bushy white brows, were as sharp and clear as chips of ice. He didn't carry a gavel. He carried an almost palpable weight of absolute authority. He sat, the old chair groaning in protest. He surveyed the room, his gaze lingering for a moment on Kincaid's polished lawyer, then on Coulter's stoic face, and finally on Alara's. He saw everything. "This is a territorial hearing, not a circus," he began, his voice a dry, gravelly rasp that cut through the expectant hush. "Anyone who makes a sound without my say-so will find themselves contemplating the inside of the Santa Mesa jail. We are here to hear a petition from the citizens of the Dry Willow District. Mrs. Tansey, you may proceed." Mabel Tansey, her schoolteacher's dress neat despite the heat, stepped forward. Her voice was shaking, but clear. "Your Honor, on behalf of the undersigned ranchers and citizens, I present this petition." She laid the sheaf of papers, signed by Jonah, the Millers, and a dozen others who had found their courage overnight, on the table. "We ask the court to investigate the illegal seizure of public water rights and the subsequent damages perpetrated by Mr. Silas Kincaid." Before she could step back, Kincaid's lawyer, Sterling, was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The very premise is slanderous. My client, Mr. Kincaid, has acted entirely within the bounds of the law, offering succor to a struggling community." "Duly noted, Mr. Sterling," Bram said, his voice flat. "And your client's generosity is heartwarming. You may present your case." Sterling opened his briefcase with a flourish. "Gladly, Your Honor." He produced a stack of documents, tied in a neat ribbon. "These are the water contracts, duly signed and executed by the ranchers in question. They prove, unequivocally, that all water rights were legally transferred to my client's enterprise as collateral against financial instruments they willingly accepted. The sanctity of the contract is the bedrock of our great nation. Your Honor, the water is, and I quote the territorial charter, a private asset, to be bought and sold like any other commodity." He presented the documents to the clerk, a smug smile on his face. Bram picked one up, glancing at the complex, impenetrable text and the smudged, barely legible county seal at the bottom. "Mr. Sterling," Bram said, "this contract would take a Philadelphia lawyer a week to understand. I doubt these ranchers had that long." "They were free to seek counsel, Your Honor," Sterling said smoothly. "Were they?" Bram's voice was dangerously soft. He looked at Alara. "Miss Wynne, you were Mr. Kincaid's clerk. Do you have anything to add to this matter of private assets?" Alara stepped forward, her heart hammering. She placed the oilcloth bundle on the witness rail and carefully unwrapped it. She ignored the contracts, the lawyer, and Kincaid's burning glare. She unrolled the map. "Your Honor," she began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "This is a geological survey map of the Silver Thread Creek Aquifer. It was commissioned by Mr. Kincaid himself, as you can see." She traced a line with her finger. "The headwaters, the source of the entire creek, are located here. In Section 9, according to the original territorial survey, Section 9 is designated as public trust land. It does not and has never belonged to Mr. Kincaid. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. The water he is selling, Alara continued, her voice ringing with the clarity of fact, is not his to sell. He built an illegal dam on public land, diverted the water into his own reservoir, and created a drought, all to force his neighbors to sign contracts for water that was already theirs by right. It is not a contract. Your Honor, it is extortion. Sterling was on his feet, his face flushed. Preposterous this. This map is a fabrication, an unsubstantiated drawing by a disgruntled former employee. It has the surveyor's seal, Bram noted, peering at the corner of the map. He then looked to Coulter. Mr. Hale, I am told you have something for the court as well. Coulter Hale did not speak. He stepped forward, a large, silent man. He reached into a burlap sack and placed the singed, blackened turpentine can on the rail in front of the judge. It landed with a heavy, metallic thud. A faint, oily, chemical smell instantly permeated the hot air of the courtroom. And what is this? Bram asked. Jonah Pike stepped forward, his face grim. I found that myself. Judge, in the ashes, right where the wildfire started on Coulter's northern fence line. I'm a blacksmith. I know the smell of turpentine and oil. That fire wasn't an accident. It was set. The room erupted. Shouts of murderer and arsonist filled the air. Kincaid sat ramrod straight, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Bram slammed his hand on the bench, the sound like a gunshot. Silence. The room fell quiet instantly. We are now moving from a civil complaint to a criminal investigation. His icy gaze fell on Rusk. Deputy, did you investigate the cause of this fire? Rusk, for the first time, was forced to speak. We determined it was an act of God, Your Honor, a stray lightning strike from the storm. The storm that never rained? Bram asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Rusk paled. How convenient. He looked back at Alara. Miss Wynne, I am told there is more. This was the moment. Alara took the small, folded note from the bundle. This is a handwritten letter, Your Honor, from Mr. Kincaid, to Deputy Rusk. Objection! Sterling shouted. Hearsay forgery. A moment. Counsel, Bram said, holding up a hand. He looked at Rusk. Deputy, you testified under oath that your witnesses at the fire were unreliable. You said, and the clerk will confirm, that the townsfolk were biased. Is that correct? That's right, Rusk said, puffing out his chest, sensing a victory. They're all in it together. You can't trust a word they say. I see, Bram said. So we need an unbiased witness, someone who can't lie. He turned to Mabel Tansey. Mrs. Tansey, do you have something for the court? Mabel stepped forward, her face a mask of determination. I do, Your Honor. She opened her bag and produced a small, square, black and white photograph, still damp from its development. I am not an expert on fires, Your Honor, but I am an expert in penmanship. This is a photograph I took of the note in question. I have enlarged it to make the handwriting clearly visible. She placed the photograph on the rail. The image was Stark Kincaid's elegant, looping script, magnified and undeniable. Ortega Ridge, burn. A clever trick, Sterling scoffed. But it proves nothing. On the contrary, Mr. Sterling, Bram said. He motioned to his clerk. Bring me the county tax ledger for 1888, the one Mr. Kincaid signed himself when he registered his distillery. A thick, heavy book was brought forth. Bram opened it, his gnarled finger running down the page. He laid the photograph next to the ledger. He didn't need to be a handwriting expert. The arrogant, backward loop of the K, the sharp, decisive cross of the T, they were identical. A perfect match, a signature on a tax form, and a signature on a death warrant. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the silence of a held breath, the silence of a chess game ending in an undeniable checkmate. Sterling stared, his mouth agape, his polished Eastern civility cracked. Rusk looked as if he had been punched in the gut. And Silas Kincaid, stripped of his lawyer's defenses, exposed by his own arrogant hand, finally, completely, broke. He leaped to his feet, his face a mask of purple rage, his fists clenched. The veneer of the businessman was gone, revealing the raw, greedy tyrant beneath. "Fools!" he roared, his voice cracking with fury. He wasn't speaking to the judge. He was screaming at the entire, silent room of ranchers he had tried to ruin. "You think this changes anything? The contracts are signed. The law's on my side. I bought that whole damn creek, and I'll see you all crawl through the dust and beg me for a single drop." The room erupted. It was not a murmur this time. It was a roar. The collective, pent-up fury of 100 wronged souls finally unleashed. Kincaid had not just confessed. He had gloated. Bang! Bram's hand hit the bench. Bang, bang. "Order," he bellowed, his voice carrying an astonishing power. "Order in this court." The room, slowly, reluctantly, fell silent. Bram was on his feet, his small frame radiating an icy rage. "Mr. Kincaid," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Thank you for your confession. It will be noted in the record." He turned to a tall, quiet man who had been standing by the door, a man wearing the badge of a U. Marshal Doyle, take this man into custody." Kincaid's face went slack with shock as the marshal stepped forward. But in the ensuing chaos, as the crowd surged and shouted, Rusk saw his chance. The law had failed him. Now, he would make his own. He lunged, not for Kincaid, but for Elara. She was the source. She was the one who had brought him down. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in like talons. "You're coming with me, you little—" He never finished. A blur of motion came from his left. Coulter Hale, who had been a statue of stone, moved with the speed of a striking snake. He didn't throw a punch. He simply slammed the heel of his hand into Rusk's chest, a single, brutal, efficient blow that sent the deputy stumbling backward, gasping for air. Rusk, enraged, drew his pistol, but he was too slow. Two of the Miller brothers, who had been standing nearby, converged on him. One grabbed his gun arm, twisting it until the pistol clattered to the floor. The other, along with Jonah Pike, slammed him against the wall. They were no longer afraid. The tin star meant nothing. The fight was over in 5 seconds. Marshal Doyle, seeing the situation, calmly walked over, retrieved the fallen pistol, and produced a pair of handcuffs. He snapped them onto Rusk's wrists. The metallic click, a sound of final, satisfying justice. Judge Bram stood, surveying the scene. Kincaid, pale and trembling. In the grip of the marshal, Rusk, red-faced and defeated, held against the wall by the very ranchers he had terrorized. "This hearing is concluded," Bram announced, his voice ringing through the now quiet room. "By the authority of the United States Territorial Court, I am issuing an immediate injunction. The dam at the Silver Thread headwaters is to be dismantled, effective immediately. The creek will run free." A cheer went up, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. "Furthermore," Bram continued, his voice cutting through the celebration, "Mr. Kincaid and Mr. Rusk will be held without bail, pending a full criminal trial for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted arson. Marshal, remove the prisoners." As Kincaid was led away, a broken, defeated man, his gaze fell on Elara. It was a look of pure, venomous hatred, but she met it without flinching. Coulter came to her side, his hand resting lightly on her back. A silent, protective presence. He looked down at her, at this small, quiet woman who had faced down a tyrant with nothing but the truth. The battle for the courtroom was won, but he knew, with a cold certainty, that Kinsinad's hatred would not die in a jail cell. The war was not over. The eruption in the courtroom was a force of nature, a flash flood of raw, human emotion. For a moment, it was pandemonium. Ranchers were cheering, some were crying, others were pounding each other on the back. The sheer, explosive relief of a valley that had been suffocating for years drowned out all other sound. In that chaotic, roiling sea of humanity, Silas Kincaid was an island of cold, calculating fury, while all eyes were on the Miller brothers subduing a sputtering, defeated Rusk. Kincaid saw his opening. Marshal Abram Doyle, a good man, but only one man, was occupied with securing the deputy. Kincaid's lawyer, Sterling, looking ashen and useless, was babbling about appeals. No one was watching the serpent. A man near the back, a known face from Kincaid's distillery, suddenly let out a wild yell and threw a clumsy, deliberate punch at his neighbor. The fight was a cheap, transparent ploy, but it was enough. It was a distraction. In the second that heads turned, that the marshal took a step toward the new disturbance, Kincaid moved. He was not a fighter, but he was lithe and quick. He slipped through the throng of bodies like an eel, melting into the chaos near the main doors, and then, simply, vanishing. It was Mabel Tansey who saw it first. "He's gone!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the din. "Kincaid is gone!" The celebration died instantly, replaced by a cold, stomach-churning dread. Marshal Doyle cursed, shoving his way toward the door, but he was too late. Coulter Hale didn't even look. His eyes, hard and certain, met Ilara's. He knew. Kincaid wasn't just fleeing. A man like that, cornered and humiliated, doesn't just run. He turns and bites. He salts the earth behind him. "The bridge," Coulter said, his voice a low, urgent command. Ilara understood instantly. There was only one escape route east through the mountains that a man on a fast horse could take: Crow's Mouth. And spanning the deepest part of that chasm was the El Viento suspension bridge. It wasn't just a bridge. It was the main artery for supplies, for cattle, for life. To destroy it was to isolate Dry Willow, to choke off the very help that was now on its way. It was a final, spiteful act of war. "My horse," was all she said. They didn't wait for the marshal. They pushed through the bewildered crowd, out into the blinding, hot sunlight. The sky, which had been clear over Santa Mesa, was now dominated by a massive, bruised purple thunderhead that was boiling up over the mountains to the west. It was the storm that had passed Ortega Ridge, now turning back with a vengeance. The air was thick, tasting of dust and ozone. They ran to the livery, Coulter throwing coins at the startled stable boy. In less than a minute they were mounted, kicking their horses into a gallop, leaving the town and its brief, stolen victory behind them. They were a two-person posse, riding against a madman, under a sky that was preparing for battle. The ride was a frantic, punishing race against time. The wind, a hot, gusting force, whipped at their faces. The first, distant rumble of thunder rolled across the plains, a low, guttural growl from the belly of the storm. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate in Coulter's very bones, a primal warning. They reached the entrance to Crow's Mouth as the first drops of rain, fat and heavy as coins, began to fall. The rocks of the canyon were dark, slick with the sudden moisture. They pushed their horses harder, the animals' hooves slipping on the wet stone, the sound of their frantic pursuit echoing off the narrow walls. Then they saw it. The El Viento Bridge was a spider's web of rope and timber, strung across a 500-foot drop. It swayed in the rising wind, a fragile, man-made thread in a world of monolithic stone. And on the far side, a lone figure was working frantically near the main support cable. Kincaid. Beside him was a small, heavy crate, dynamite.
He's got a horse tethered on the other side. Coulter yelled over the wind. He means to blow it and ride out. They dismounted, leaving their horses, and ran the last 100 yards on foot. They were halfway across the groaning, swaying bridge when Kincaid saw them. He straightened up, leaving the fuse he was setting. He didn't look surprised. He looked feral. He drew a pistol, the same kind of small, elegant derringer a gambler might carry. It was a toy compared to Coulter's revolver. But on this narrow, swaying bridge, it was a death sentence. That's far enough. Hale? Kincaid's voice was thin and reedy against the wind, but filled with a triumphant madness. One more step and the little bookkeeper gets it. Coulter froze. Elara came to a stop beside him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The bundle of evidence, which she still carried, felt impossibly heavy. "It's over, Kincaid," Coulter said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "The marshal's right behind us." "The marshal can pick up the pieces," Kincaid shrieked. Laughing, he gestured with his pistol not at Elara, but at the oilcloth bundle she clutched to her chest. "That's what this is about, isn't it, your precious proof? Throw it over, throw it into the canyon, and I'll let you walk away." Elara looked at the bundle, the map and the ledger that had cost her everything. Then she looked at Kincaid's face, twisted with hate. She took a step forward. "Elara, no!" Coulter hissed, grabbing for her arm. She shook him off. She stood firm, the wind whipping her hair across her face. Her gaze locked on Kincaid. She did not look afraid. She looked righteous. "The people of Dry Willow are thirsty because of you," she said, her voice clear and carrying, a bell of truth in the heart of the storm. "This isn't just paper. It's their water. It's their lives. You won't take anything else from them." Kincaid's face contorted in a sneer. "Brave words, little girl. They'll be your last—" Crack boom. The world exploded in a blinding flash of white light and an instantaneous, deafening clap of thunder. It was not a distant rumble. It was here. It was now. A bolt of lightning, thick as a tree trunk, struck the high stone pillar on the far side of the chasm, the one anchoring the main suspension cable. The air smelled of burned rock and ozone. The entire bridge shuddered, a violent, convulsive heave, as if the chasm itself had shrugged. A high, metallic zing filled the air as the superheated cable vibrated like a plucked guitar string. Kincaid staggered, thrown off balance by the shock wave. The derringer wavered in his hand. It was all the opening Coulter needed. He moved. He was not a man. He was a force. In 2 long, desperate strides, he closed the distance. He didn't go for the gun. He slammed his body into Kincaid's, his shoulder connecting with a brutal, solid impact. The derringer fired, a pathetic pop lost in the thunder, the bullet flying harmlessly into the churning gray sky. The gun flew from Kincaid's hand, skittering across the wooden planks and disappearing into the abyss. They grappled. 2 men locked in a desperate, clumsy struggle on the swaying, shuddering bridge. It was not a graceful fight. They slipped on the rain-slicked planks, their boots skidding near the edge. Kincaid, fueled by a madman's strength, clawed at Coulter's face. Coulter, focused and grim, fought to subdue him, to get him pinned. Kincaid twisted, his foot catching on a loose plank. He lost his footing, his arms pinwheeling wildly. He let out a choked, terrified cry as he fell backward, over the low rope railing. But he didn't fall into the chasm. His hand, in a last, reflexive act of survival, caught one of the thick support ropes. He dangled there, his fine suit tearing, his face a mask of pure, abject terror, suspended over a 500-foot drop. Coulter, breathing heavily, knelt at the edge. He looked down at the man who had tried to ruin him, who had tried to kill the woman he cared for. He saw not a villain, but a pathetic, terrified man. He reached down, his hand outstretched. "Kincaid, take my hand, it's over." Kincaid stared up, his eyes wide with disbelief.
Then, with a renewed, venomous hatred, he saw not mercy, but an opportunity. He let go with one hand and lunged upward, not for Coulter's offered hand, but for his wrist. He was going to pull Coulter over with him. As his hand closed around Coulter's arm, he opened his mouth and bit down, his teeth sinking into Coulter's flesh like a rabid animal. Coulter roared, a sound of pure pain and shock. But as he struggled, Alara saw something else. The dynamite. The fuse Kincaid had been setting was sputtering, a small, angry fizzing that had been lit by a stray spark from the lightning strike. It had less than a minute. She didn't scream. She didn't panic. She pulled the small, sharp utility knife that Coulter had given her for mending leather from her belt. She ran to the crate, knelt, and sawed at the thick, waterproof fuse with a desperate, frantic energy. The fizzing grew louder, faster. Coulter felt Kincaid's weight, a dead, determined anchor, pulling him toward the edge. He tried to shake him off, but the man's teeth were locked in his arm. "Now, Hale," Kincaid shrieked, his voice muffled. "We die together." The fuse was cut. Alara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the bundle of dynamite sticks, their fuse now a short, angry, sputtering snake, and with a cry, she hurled it over the side of the bridge, as far away from the support structure as she could. It fell, tumbling end over end into the misty depths of the canyon. Coulter, with a final, desperate surge of strength, slammed his injured arm against the bridge's main cable. The impact, combined with Kincaid's own weight, was enough. Kincaid's teeth tore free, and with a last, surprised cry, his grip failed. He fell, a small, dark shape swallowed by the mist and the rain. Alara and Coulter had a split second to brace themselves. A dull, powerful boom echoed up from the chasm, a deep, subterranean concussion that shook the bridge one last time. The explosion was contained, its force dissipated by the vast emptiness of the canyon. The bridge held. They were alone, shaking, bleeding, soaked to the bone, but alive. On the far side of the chasm, Marshal Abram Doyle and 3 deputies appeared, their rifles ready. They had heard the shot, seen the struggle. They took in the scene, the empty bridge, the 2 survivors, the frayed fuse by the abandoned crate. Doyle, an old friend of Bram's, understood. He gave a single, solemn nod. And then the rain came. It was not the few, hesitant drops from before. It was a deluge, a solid gray curtain of water that fell from the sky with a roar, as if the heavens had finally broken open. It was a cleansing, a baptism. It washed the soot and the fear from their faces, the blood from Coulter's arm. In the distance, they heard a new sound, a deep, growing rumble that was not thunder. It was the sound of the Silver Thread Creek, freed from its prison, swollen with the fresh rain, roaring back to life. The land was breathing again. Alara looked at Coulter, at his strong, tired face, at the rain plastering his hair to his head. She saw the man who had given her his coat, who had tended her wounds, who had believed her, who had fought for her. She closed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in his soaked, solid chest. She held on, not with the frantic grip of fear, but with the solid, grounding weight of a choice. She was not seeking protection. She was offering solace. She was holding him because, through all the fire and the lies, she had chosen to trust him, and he had proven worthy of that trust. Coulter's arms came around her, pulling her tight. He rested his chin on the top of her head, and they stood there, 2 solitary figures in the heart of the storm, holding each other up as the world was washed clean around them. After a long time, they turned. They walked back across the bridge, collected their horses, and began the slow ride back to Ortega Ridge. The rain lashed their faces, but it felt different now. It was the salty taste of tears, sweat, and effort. It was the sweet taste of water on a thirsty land. It was the taste of victory. The ride back to Ortega Ridge was a slow, reverent procession, The rain, which had been a violent, roaring deluge in the canyon, softened as they descended onto the plains. It became a steady, soaking shower, a balm on the burned and thirsty land. The air, washed clean of ash and fear, smelled of wet sagebrush, creosote, and the rich, dark scent of the awakened earth. They were not the first to arrive. As they crested the final rise, the sight that met them was not one of devastation, but of resurrection. A crowd had gathered, not a mob, not a posse, but a community. Jonah Pike and the Miller brothers were there, their faces streaked with a mixture of soot and clean rain, but their eyes were shining. And with them were a dozen other ranchers, men and women who had heard Jonah's call, who had seen the smoke, and who, finally, had chosen hope over fear. They were not idle. They were working. A joyous, chaotic ballet of purposeful action. With Judge Bram's injunction as their shield and the rain as their blessing, they had opened the head gates, the main irrigation ditch, which had been a dry, cracked scar for months, was now a rushing, gurgling river. Men were using shovels not to fight fire, but to clear away the last of the mud and debris, guiding the life-giving water into the smaller troughs that fed their own desperate lands downstream. The sound was a symphony. It was the sound of rushing water, of men's cheerful shouts, of women's relieved laughter. It was the sound of a valley drinking its fill after a long, agonizing thirst. As Coulter and Alara rode into the yard, a great cheer went up, a sound so full of gratitude and joy that it seemed to push back the gray clouds. Mabel Tansey stood on the porch of the ranch house, her posture straight and proud. She held Judge Bram's official order, the paper already limp from the humidity, but its words were iron. "By the authority of the United States Territorial Court," she read, her schoolteacher's voice carrying over the happy noise. "It is hereby decreed that the waterway known as the Silver Thread Creek and all its aquifers and headwaters is, and has always been, the property of the community. Its use shall be governed by a council of local ranchers, for the benefit of all, not the profit of one." Another cheer, louder this time, a roar of pure, democratic victory. They were not just getting water. They were getting their lives back, their futures. Jonah Pike, his big hands surprisingly gentle, was nailing a freshly planed piece of wood to the main gate post, the one Alara had clung to on that first, terrifying night. He had painted 4 simple, powerful words on it in stark black paint. "Dry willow not for sale." It was a declaration, a new cornerstone for a town that was being reborn. Coulter swung down from his horse, moving stiffly, his arm aching. He was immediately surrounded, hands clapping him on the back, voices thick with gratitude. He was no longer the hermit of Ortega Ridge. He was a hero. He deflected their praise with gruff, single-word answers, his gaze scanning the crowd, looking for Alara. She had dismounted more slowly, overwhelmed by the scene. This was what she had fought for, what she had nearly died for. This sound of life, this sight of hope. A woman she didn't know, one of the Miller's wives, came up and hugged her, whispering, "Thank you, child. You saved us." Alara could only nod, a lump forming in her throat. The rain began to fall harder again, a cool, persistent drumming that urged the crowd to disperse, to get back to their own lands, to their own newly filled troughs, as the wagons began to rattle away, their owners calling out final, heartfelt thanks. Coulter made his way through the dwindling crowd to her side. "You're soaked," he said, his voice low, meant only for her. "So are you," she replied, a small smile touching her lips. He looked around, at the muddy yard, the dripping eaves of the house. "It'll be hours before this place is right again." He gestured with his head toward the barn. "It's dry in there." She nodded, and, together, they led the horses into the deep, quiet shelter of the barn. The moment they stepped inside, the world changed, the sounds of the celebration, of the rain on the open ground, were replaced by a soft, intimate drumming on the barn's high tin roof. It was a gentle, rhythmic patter, a sound that enclosed them, creating a world that consisted only of this space. The air was thick with the smells of damp hay, of horses, of leather, and of the rain-soaked earth outside. It was a clean, honest smell. A few shafts of gray light pierced the gloom through cracks in the old wood, illuminating the dust motes and tiny droplets of moisture that hung in the air. They worked in a comfortable, practiced silence, unsaddling the tired horses. Their movements were synchronized, a dance they had learned in the tense days of waiting. Coulter rubbed the mare down with a dry sack, his movements slow and soothing. Alara refilled the hay manger, her hands moving with a new, confident familiarity. When the work was done, they stood in the central aisle of the barn, the two horses munching contentedly in their stalls. The rain on the roof was the only sound. The world outside, with its legal battles and its future councils, felt a million miles away. Here, there was only the quiet, the warmth of the animals, and the shared, unspoken culmination of their journey. Coulter turned to her. The gray light was soft on her face, washing away the last of the soot and exhaustion. He saw not the fugitive, not the clerk, not the hero. He just saw Alara. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment, and gently brushed a stray, damp strand of hair from her cheek. His fingers were rough against her skin, but his touch was as light as a sigh. She leaned into the touch, her eyes closing for a fraction of a second. She took a step closer, into his space, into his warmth. She laid her hand flat against his chest, over the damp, coarse fabric of his shirt, beneath her palm. She could feel the slow, steady, powerful beat of his heart. It was the sound of his life, a rhythm she now knew as well as her own. Her breath hitched, a small, sharp intake of air. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and luminous in the gloom. The words came from a place deeper than thought, a place of pure, overwhelming feeling. "No one's touched me like this," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. It was gratitude and wonder and a profound, aching relief. Coulter did not answer with words. He didn't need to. He simply looked at her, his gaze holding an ocean of unsaid things of respect, of awe, of a protective tenderness that was more powerful than any declaration. He lowered his own hands, not to embrace her, not to pull her into a passionate clinch, but to find her own. His large, calloused hands gently took hers. He turned one of them over and looked at the raw, blistered palm. He then lowered his gaze to her wrist, to the faint, fading abrasions from the ropes, the same wounds he had tended on that first night. His thumb, so rough and scarred, began to trace the delicate, blue-green lines of the veins there. The touch was feather-light, a deliberate, reverent exploration. It was a touch that acknowledged her pain, her fight, her survival. It was a touch that was devoid of demand, full of an absolute, grounding respect. He was not just touching her skin, he was touching her story. Tears welled in Alara's eyes, but they did not fall. She had no more tears of sorrow left to cry. He raised his eyes to meet hers, and then, slowly, he leaned in. The kiss was nothing like the first. Hesitant exploration in the dark kitchen. There was no question in it, no uncertainty. It was a kiss of deep, mutual, and soul-deep recognition. It was slow, and it was sure. It was the kiss of a man who had come back to life, and the woman who had brought him there. It was long and deep, and utterly private. A silent covenant made in the heart of the storm's aftermath. The steady, drumming rain on the roof was their witness, a sound that wrapped around them, sealing them in their own perfect, quiet world. Outside, the Silver Thread Creek, swollen and alive, sang its song of freedom as it rushed toward the thirsty plains. Inside the barn, two hearts that had learned the harsh language of solitude were now, finally, silent, beating in the same easy rhythm. The old dog, Gus, who had been curled on a pile of sacks near the door, raised his head. He let out 3 short, soft barks, woof, 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 a sound that was not an alarm, not a warning, but a simple, contented punctuation. Then, with a sigh, he laid his head back on his paws and went to sleep. Coulter and Alara finally, slowly, broke the kiss. They didn't pull away completely. They rested their foreheads together, their breath mingling in the cool, clean air and in the quiet, soft light of the barn. As the rain continued to fall, they smiled. It was a shared, silent, perfect smile, born of fire and flood, of victory, of water, and of a feeling that was just beginning to rise, as powerful and as life-giving as the creek itself. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and consider hitting the hype button to help share it with even more listeners.